What if the world's most powerful people were also its most unhinged? Behind crowns and ceremonies lie obsessions, delusions, and decisions so bizarre they read like fiction, but every one of them happened. A king who thought he was made of glass, an emperor who ruled the afterlife with rivers of mercury, a queen who preserved her husband's bathroom forever. These aren't fairy tales. They're facts with footnotes. So buckle in, because royalty isn't just gold and glory. Sometimes it's pure, regal madness. Before we dive headfirst into royal madness, make sure you're subscribed, because this is just the tip of the jeweled iceberg. We drop strange, true stories every week, and you won't want to miss what's coming. While you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Are you listening at 3 a.m. like a medieval court astrologer, or mid-commute like a modern monarch stuck in traffic? Let us know below. 1. Charles VI of France, Charles the Mad. Some kings ruled with iron fists. Charles VI ruled with glass bones, at least in his mind. It wasn't a metaphor. At the peak of his madness, Charles of Valois believed he was literally made of glass, not metaphorical transparency, not fragile ego. Actual, physical, shatter-on-contact glass. And when you are the anointed sovereign of one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms, your delusions don't stay in the drawing room. They become policy. They shape court rituals. They interrupt diplomacy. They reorder a country around the fear that its monarch might crack. He wore reinforced clothing to protect himself. He avoided people. He reportedly forbade others from touching him. Some accounts say he even had rods sewn into his garments to prevent accidental bending just in case the royal tibia snapped mid-curtsy. That might sound like theater, but for the French court in the late 1300s, this was deadly serious. Charles VI wasn't just a man, he was France itself. The king was supposed to be the body politic. But what happens when that body thinks it's a wine glass? The glass delusion was not unique to Charles, though it found its most powerful home in him. In late medieval and early Renaissance Europe, it surfaced in case studies and medical records, almost always among the elite. Why? Because only the rich could afford the time, space, and audience for a psychosis so performative. When you are poor and breakable, nobody cares. When you are king and breakable, the entire kingdom breaks with you. Charles didn't start out like this. As a child, he was celebrated for his intelligence, energy, and charm. He was crowned at just 11 years old, after the death of his father, Charles V. Initially, governance fell to his uncles, who had a taste for luxury and factionalism. But when Charles took control at 21, there was hope. He dismissed his corrupt relatives. He brought back honest advisors. France seemed poised for renewal. And then he shattered. His first psychotic break came in 1392, after a failed assassination attempt on one of his counselors. The trauma may have triggered something already lurking. Riding through a forest, Charles suddenly turned on his own men and began striking them down with his sword. When it was over, 4 knights were dead. The king fell into a coma. And when he awoke, the cracks were permanent. From then on, Charles suffered intermittent and increasingly severe episodes of madness. He would forget who he was. He would fail to recognize his wife. He would flee in terror from his own reflection. And most infamously, he believed he was made of fragile glass. Try, if you can, to imagine being a courtier in this world. Every time you stepped into the king's chamber, you had to remember, don't get too close, don't make sudden movements, and definitely don't offer him your hand. There's a reason historians describe this period as monarchy under glass. Governance became theater, diplomacy became mime. One chronicler writes of Charles sitting motionless for hours, refusing to speak or move, as if fearing the slightest shift would cause him to shatter. Another describes him fleeing in panic when a servant accidentally brushed against him. This was not a man pretending. This was a man possessed by fragility. And here's the horror. The more Charles broke, the more the kingdom fractured. With the king unfit to rule, factions re-emerged. His uncles returned. His brother Louis of Orléans vied for influence. The queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, played her own strategic hand. The Burgundians circled. France spiraled toward civil war, not because of external threats, but because the man at its center had mentally checked out. It's tempting to see this as a tragedy, and it was, but it was also farce. In 1393, during a court masquerade known as the Bal des Ardents, Charles and several nobles dressed as wild men in flammable costumes. Someone brought a torch too close. The men caught fire. 4 died. Charles survived only because his aunt threw her dress over him. Eyewitnesses describe screaming nobles running through the palace like human candles. It was supposed to be entertainment. It became a metaphor. Because that was Charles's reign. Fire and glass. Fragile bodies and combustible politics. What makes his case so enduringly bizarre isn't just the madness. It's how the kingdom had to function around it. Ministers came and went depending on whether Charles was lucid that week. Diplomats scheduled meetings around episodes. The monarchy didn't abdicate, it adapted. It tiptoed. In today's language, Charles likely suffered from a form of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder with psychotic features. But back then, medicine wasn't the point, image was. And the image was grotesque. A king hiding behind curtains, terrified of touch, believing himself an object, a breakable one. Even stranger, the glass delusion wasn't treated as utterly insane by everyone. It mirrored a broader belief that glass was sacred, mystical, even alchemical. In some strange way, Charles wasn't just mentally ill, he was prophetically fragile, a symbol, maybe, of monarchy's own absurd contradictions. All-powerful, yet totally exposed. Revered, yet constantly at risk of collapse. After his death in 1422, France plunged deeper into war. His son, Charles VII, would eventually become the king, supported by Joan of Arc herself, a figure straddling vision and madness. Maybe it runs in royal blood, a tendency to confuse identity with illusion, to govern by fantasy, to break publicly. Today, historians read Charles's reign like a cracked mirror, warped, sharp, strangely revealing. The glass king reminds us that even divine right cannot keep the mind intact. That power, once internalized, can distort the self beyond repair. That the crown doesn't protect you, it presses down, until the cracks spread. But if you think a glass king is hard to top, wait until you meet the queen who traveled with her dead husband's coffin like it was a carry-on bag. 2. Juana I of Castile, Joanna the Mad. Royal mourning usually follows a script. Black veils, solemn courts, buried kings, and the polite fiction that everyone moves on. But Juana of Castile threw out the script, locked the stage door, and took the corpse with her. After her husband Philip died suddenly in 1506, Juana did not simply grieve, she made grief logistical, physical, political, personal in the most public way. According to chroniclers and court documents, she traveled with his coffin by some accounts for months, insisting on keeping it near, at times refusing burial, and clashing with officials over what to do with the body of a man who was no longer king, no longer breathing, and possibly no longer the person she thought he was. The exact timeline is debated, the motivations are murky, and historians still argue about how much of it was devotion, and how much was dynastic gaslighting. But what's certain is this. A queen of Spain was once defined by her refusal to let go of a corpse. Juana was born in 1479, daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the Catholic monarchs, architects of Spain's unification and the Inquisition. No pressure. She was never expected to rule. As the third child, she was more a pawn than a player. But dynastic chance is like a grim lottery. Her older siblings died, her mother named her heir, and suddenly, Juana became the next sovereign of Castile. One problem. Nobody ever planned for Juana to be a queen, especially not Juana herself. She was married off to Philip of Habsburg, known as Philip the Handsome, as part of the usual chessboard politics. And depending on which historian you ask, it was either a politically strategic pairing gone sour or an intense, tempestuous relationship with sharp turns and sharp elbows. In any case, Philip died young, 28 years old, possibly of typhoid fever, or poison, or heartbreak, or food poisoning, or palace intrigue. No one really agrees, but he died. And Juana unraveled. What followed was not quiet mourning. It was a moving royal wake, with a trail of scandal, resistance, and whispered accusations behind it. The coffin journey is the part that always gets retold. Juana allegedly ordered Philip's body to be transported across Castile, delaying burial for reasons that seemed, at best, spiritual, and at worst, deeply unhinged. Some sources say she insisted on visiting the coffin regularly. Others describe her opening it to gaze upon him. The stories blur reality and rumor so completely that even seasoned historians now treat the account like a broken mirror, part reflection, part distortion, fully unresolved. But it's not just the coffin. It's what the coffin meant, because Juana wasn't just a widow. She was a queen with a disputed claim, surrounded by men who needed her to seem unfit. Her father, Ferdinand, saw a chance to retake control of Castile. The nobles around her feared instability. Her son, Charles, yes, that Charles, later Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, would eventually benefit from sidelining her. And in this ecosystem of convenience, Juana's mourning became a convenient excuse. A woman unwilling to bury her husband? She must be mad. Was she? Some scholars think Juana was clinically mentally ill, perhaps bipolar, or suffering from schizoaffective disorder. Others argue she was not mentally broken, but politically crushed, isolated, manipulated, and framed. After all, much of what we know comes from accounts written by men with everything to gain from her removal. Take the phrase, Juana the Mad itself. It wasn't a medical diagnosis, it was a nickname, a brand, a pretext to confine her for the rest of her life, first by her father, then by her son. She spent nearly 50 years in various levels of isolation, her royal title intact but her power entirely removed. She was a queen in name, a prisoner in practice. So what was the truth? Was Juana tragically unwell, unable to govern, lost in obsessive grief? Or was she lucid enough to understand what was being done to her but powerless to stop it? Imagine, just for a moment, that she was the latter, that she wasn't mad but grieving, deeply, and being told that her mourning was madness. That her refusal to bury Philip wasn't about delusion, but resistance, refusal to play the role expected of her, refusal to hand over the reins of a kingdom she had inherited. A final act of defiance, disguised as dysfunction. There's something brutally poetic about a woman whose title meant Queen of Castile being told, over and over again, to shut up, sit down, and hand over the throne because she loved too much, or mourned too loudly, or didn't smile when the regents asked her to. And that coffin she carried? Maybe it wasn't just a symbol of grief, maybe it was a banner. A reminder to everyone who wanted her silenced that she would not forget who had been taken from her and who was trying to take everything else. The political climate around Juana's supposed madness was vicious. After Philip's death, factions rose and fell. Ferdinand returned to Castile and declared her unfit to rule. She was confined in the fortress of Tordesillas, along with her daughter, and kept under guard. When Ferdinand died, her son Charles came to power and did not free her. She remained locked away, a living ghost, until her death in 1555. And all the while, the story of the corpse-following queen lived on mutated, embroidered, used as proof that she was not just mentally fragile, but dangerously so. Even now, scholars tread carefully around the question. Madness is a label history uses liberally and often inaccurately, especially for women who refuse to conform. What's more disturbing, that Juana was ill, or that she may have been perfectly sane and simply too inconvenient for a kingdom run by men? We don't know. We probably never will. That's the point. The myth is sticky precisely because the truth is brittle. But whether she was sick, grieving, manipulated, or all three at once, Juana became something more than a queen. She became a symbol of how monarchy collapses when the person at the center refuses to play their part, of how power can silence with pity instead of chains, of how grief, when politically inconvenient, becomes indistinguishable from madness in the eyes of those who benefit from the misdiagnosis. The irony? Her bloodline won. Charles V, her son, ruled a global empire. Her descendants became kings of Spain, emperors of the Holy Roman Empire, rulers of a world where mourning no longer had a face. But Juana's face, watching over a coffin in motion, locked in a fortress, staring back through the ages, still haunts. And if you think that's strange, just wait, because the next queen didn't carry death around like a memory, she carried life that was never even there. Before we go any further down this royal rabbit hole, take a second to subscribe to the channel. These stories get stranger, darker, and more unbelievable from here, and you don't want to stumble into them late. And I'm curious, where are you listening from right now? And what time is it for you? Midnight? Early morning? Let me know in the comments. History always feels different depending on the hour. 3. Mary I of England, Bloody Mary, the phantom pregnancy. For a moment, England believed salvation was growing inside a queen. Church bells were prepared, cradles were commissioned, foreign ambassadors recalculated alliances, sermons leaned forward in their sentences, waiting for the pronoun to change from she to he. And Mary I of England, Catholic, embattled, aging, and desperate, placed her entire reign on a single biological event: a pregnancy. Only there was one problem. The baby never arrived. Mary Tudor ascended the throne in 1553 under extraordinary pressure. She was the first crowned queen regnant of England, inheriting a kingdom violently divided by religion. Her father, Henry VIII, had broken with Rome. Her half-brother, Edward VI, had pushed England deeper into Protestantism. Mary intended to reverse it all. She would return England to Catholicism, heal the soul of the nation, and most importantly produce a Catholic heir to secure the future. Everything depended on her body. At 37, Mary married Philip of Spain, a political match that terrified England and delighted Catholic Europe. The marriage contract was careful, cautious, and deeply unpopular. Many English feared becoming a satellite of the Habsburg Empire. Mary didn't care. She needed a husband, she needed a child, she needed proof that God was on her side. And in 1554, she announced it. Mary was pregnant. At first, the signs seemed convincing. She stopped menstruating. Her abdomen swelled. She experienced nausea and fatigue. Doctors confirmed the diagnosis, using the best tools of the 16th century, which is to say, intuition, tradition, and optimism. The court rearranged itself around the coming birth. Philip delayed his departure from England. Advisors prepared regency plans. Parliament drafted laws assuming a royal child was imminent. England waited. And waited. 9 months passed. Then 10. Then 11. The expected birth date came and went. Nothing happened. Mary retreated from public view, citing weakness. Supporters insisted the pregnancy was simply delayed. Prayers intensified. Bells were rung preemptively. Cradles stood empty but ready. No one wanted to be the first to say it out loud. But eventually, reality intruded. There was no baby. Modern medicine has a name for what Mary likely experienced: pseudochiasis, or phantom pregnancy. A condition in which the body exhibits real symptoms of pregnancy: missed periods, abdominal distension, hormonal changes without an actual fetus. It is rare, but it is real. And it is often associated with extreme psychological stress and intense desire for pregnancy. Mary's entire identity was wrapped around that desire. She had grown up declared illegitimate, cast aside after her mother, Catherine of Aragon, was divorced and disgraced. She had watched her mother die broken and isolated. She had survived religious whiplash, political danger, and years of uncertainty about her own place in the world. When she finally became queen, she was determined to do what her father had demanded of all wives: produce an heir. Only this time, the stakes were national. So, when her body betrayed her or convinced her otherwise, it didn't just humiliate her, it destabilized the kingdom. Foreign powers began to doubt England's future. Protestant resistance hardened. Philip, increasingly distant, returned to Spain. The court grew quiet. And Mary, once radiant with purpose, withdrew into bitterness and paranoia. The phantom pregnancy didn't end quickly. It lingered, like an echo. For months, Mary refused to accept that it was false. Even after doctors quietly revised their assessments, she clung to hope. Some courtiers indulged it. Others feared contradicting her, because contradicting a queen, especially one already known for her severity, was dangerous. Eventually, there was no denying it. The pregnancy dissolved into embarrassment. The court moved on without acknowledging the absence. Officially, nothing was said. Unofficially, everything had changed. Mary had no heir. And without an heir, her entire religious project was fragile. The irony is sharp. History remembers Mary as Bloody Mary, a ruler defined by persecution and repression. But during the phantom pregnancy, she was something else entirely. A woman whose body became a political stage, a biological referendum on divine favor. When the baby failed to appear, it wasn't just Mary who looked foolish. It was Catholic legitimacy itself. Protestants interpreted the event as a sign. God had not blessed her reign. Heaven had vetoed her womb. Mary would experience a second false pregnancy, later in her reign, less celebrated, more quietly endured. By then, the hope was thinner, the court colder. She died in 1558, childless, her throne passing to her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth I. And just like that, England pivoted. Elizabeth never married, never had children, never promised a pregnancy. She learned from Mary's humiliation and chose a different strategy: power without reproduction, symbolism without biology. The Virgin Queen, instead of the Phantom Mother. But Mary's story lingers because it exposes something deeply unsettling about monarchy: how completely a ruler's body can become state property. Every ache, every change, every missed cycle was observed, interpreted, and politicized. Her pregnancy was not private, it was public infrastructure. And when it failed, the consequences were systemic. Imagine the silence in those empty nurseries, the unused christening gowns, the ambassadors quietly updating their reports. The Queen, alone with a body that had betrayed her or worse, convinced her of a miracle that never existed. There is no evidence Mary was deliberately deceiving anyone. The symptoms were real, the belief was sincere, which makes the episode more disturbing, not less. This wasn't propaganda. It was a collective hallucination shared by a court, endorsed by doctors, fueled by national desperation. An entire country wanted a baby so badly that it helped imagine one into existence. Until it couldn't. Mary's phantom pregnancy stands as one of history's strangest intersections of medicine, psychology, and power. A reminder that even crowns cannot override biology. That belief can reshape perception, but not reality. And that when a monarch's legitimacy depends on something as uncontrollable as a womb, the throne itself becomes unstable. And yet, this is still not the strangest attempt by a ruler to defy mortality, biology, or the limits of the human body. Because while Mary's body imagined life that never came, the next ruler on this list was so terrified of death that he tried to build an entire underground world to escape it. 4. Qin Shi, Huang, Mercury, and immortality. In the 3rd century BCE, China's first emperor did something few rulers have ever managed. He made the world believe he had conquered death, not by curing it, not by transcending it, but by building over it, sealing it, containing it in architecture, engineering, and alchemical fantasy. He was Qin Shi Huang, the unifier of China, the builder of the Great Wall, the annihilator of rival kingdoms, and the man who truly believed, that immortality could be manufactured. His story is one of ambition, without ceiling. A ruler who forged a centralized empire out of warring states, rewrote the calendar, standardized the written script, and then turned his gaze inward to the mirror of mortality and said, "No, not for me." In life, he ordered scholars to search for elixirs, sent ships to mystical isles, consumed alchemical substances, listened to magicians and philosophers who promised him he could cheat the void. But it's in death, or rather, what he built to confront it, that the story truly turns surreal. Beneath the hills of Xi'an lies the greatest funerary project in recorded history, a tomb complex so vast, so elaborately imagined, that more than 2,000 years later, parts of it remain untouched, not because we don't know it's there, but because we're afraid to open it. The central legend of that tomb? Rivers of Mercury. The traditional Chinese historian Sima Qian, writing about a century after Qin Shi Huang's death, described the tomb as a vast underground map of the known world. Mountains of bronze, miniature palaces, celestial ceilings painted with stars, and rivers literal flowing channels of mercury, engineered to simulate the great waterways of China. Modern archaeologists have yet to fully excavate the emperor's inner burial chamber, partly out of respect, partly out of caution. Soil samples around the tomb have revealed elevated mercury levels, suggesting that the ancient account might not be a myth, that there really may be liquid metal coursing through a subterranean empire, sealed beneath stone. Why mercury? In ancient China, mercury wasn't just a substance. It was mystical, a key ingredient in many early Taoist alchemical experiments, a symbol of transformation, eternity, power over decay. It shimmered, it resisted time, and, fatally, it poisoned those who believed in it too deeply. Qin Shi Huang, obsessed with outlasting death, reportedly consumed mercury-based elixirs in life, ironically, likely shortening his lifespan in the process. Some scholars suggest his erratic behavior in later years may have been a result of chronic mercury poisoning, paranoia, agitation, a sharp turn toward the irrational. It wasn't just madness. It was self-inflicted. But let's return to the tomb. Imagine standing at the edge of that central mound in Xi'an. You know what's under there. You know what the ancient texts say. You know the terracotta army was only a border defense, one tiny portion of a much larger necropolis. You know modern instruments are picking up mercury vapors. You know the main chamber is untouched. And yet, it stays closed. Because opening it might destroy what's inside. Because conservation technology may not be ready. Because there's something grotesquely poetic about an emperor trying to live forever by constructing a sealed replica of reality, only for it to be left sealed, suspended, unreadable, like a still-beating heart inside a locked sarcophagus. Qin Shi Huang didn't just fear death. He planned to out-administer it. He had tunnels constructed to carry his soul across metal rivers. He had traps installed, allegedly, to protect the sanctity of his new kingdom, crossbows, triggered by movement, poison channels. Mechanical deterrents designed to keep intruders out and maybe, just maybe, to keep something in. It's hard not to read all of this as metaphor. Here is a man who unified China by conquering fragmentation and then responded to mortality by building a controlled copy of the world, as if reality could be domesticated, as if eternity could be drawn to scale. He abolished feudal divisions, and then in death, drew them again as dioramas. He standardized measurement, and then built a kingdom underground where nothing would ever change. He forced his subjects to speak the same language, and then filled his tomb with silent soldiers, frozen mid-march, carved in clay. Control, all the way down. And what's most haunting? We still haven't opened the final door. 2 millennia later, we're still respecting or fearing his plan. You could call that immortality. Historians continue to debate the literal truth of the mercury rivers. The records are compelling, but they're also second-hand. Sima Qian's Records of the Grand Historian has a mythic quality, part fact, part political narrative. Still, modern science lends credence to the old story. Soil tests around the central tomb mound reveal mercury concentrations far above normal levels. The ancient texts, in this case, seem to have been unusually honest. It's not just that Qin Shi Huang wanted to live forever. It's that he wanted the world to believe he had. And for all practical purposes, it worked. His tomb remains sealed. His name still causes unease. His afterlife world is buried not just in earth, but in collective imagination. Engineers and archaeologists argue about whether we should even go in. Conservationists worry that opening the chamber might destroy what's inside before we can study it. The paint might fade. The metals might corrode. The story might disintegrate. And so we wait. In the 1970s, the discovery of the terracotta army changed the modern world's understanding of ancient China. Thousands of clay soldiers, arranged in formation, with unique faces, hairstyles, armor, and weapons, each one crafted with specificity. Each one facing east, as if expecting enemies from the direction of the old warlords. That was just the welcome mat. The emperor himself, still underground, still guarded, still encased in legend. There's something disturbingly beautiful about that. He tried to control history, tried to force memory, tried to turn myth into infrastructure, and in doing so, became unforgettable, but not untouched. In life, His regime was harsh, his laws brutal, his punishments extreme. He banned books, executed scholars, burned ideas he couldn't control. And in that sense, the Mercury tomb is more than just a failed science experiment or a megalomaniac's final vanity project. It's a final act of censorship, a library sealed forever, a story frozen in silence. What's worse, that the Mercury is real or that we still hesitate to find out? The imperial tomb remains one of the great archaeological mysteries of the world, not because we can't reach it, but because we won't. Not yet. Not until we're ready to confront whatever he left behind. Be it poison, be it prophecy, be it a mirror, finally showing us how far a ruler will go to pretend he is not like the rest of us. And if you think a Mercury river is a strange thing to pour into a royal tomb, wait until you meet the emperor who tried to turn his palace into an alchemical dreamscape and left his enemies so confused, they nearly forgot they were supposed to rule. 5. Jiajing Emperor, Ming, China, alchemy fixation, and a palace plot. Every court has its rumors. The Ming court had potions, immortal maidens, poisonous incense, and a near-successful murder attempt, involving palace maids and a silken cord. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. First, let's meet the man behind the smoke. The Jiajing Emperor reigned from 1521 to 1567. A reign defined less by governance and more by metaphysics, rituals, and a spectacular distance from reality. In fact, for most of his 45-year rule, the emperor of the vast Ming dynasty was more interested in chasing immortality than, say, running China. He wasn't lazy, he was busy, just not with what anyone else thought mattered. Born Zhu Hukong, he wasn't originally supposed to be emperor. He was a cousin of the previous emperor, selected through a political compromise after a succession crisis. It was a bad omen, and Jiajing made sure everyone knew it. The moment he got the throne, he began reshaping it not just physically, but cosmologically. He wasn't here to continue traditions. He was here to rewrite the celestial script. First, he picked a fight with Confucian bureaucracy by refusing to honor his predecessor as his father. In Confucian terms, this was a heresy against ancestral order. Jiajing didn't care. He staged a multi-year political drama to get the court to recognize his biological father as the rightful emperor father, even though the man had never ruled. Why? Because Jiajing believed that lineage wasn't just political, it was metaphysical. The emperor had to align himself with the cosmos, not just legal precedent. This was just the beginning. He then all but abandoned public life. He withdrew from state audiences, minimized civil examinations, and isolated himself in a series of increasingly esoteric palace rituals. His interest wasn't in laws, wars, or taxes. It was in Taoist alchemy, specifically, the quest for immortality. Taoism, in its religious form, had long fascinated Chinese rulers, but Jiajing took it to a theatrical extreme. He built temples, employed Taoist priests as advisors, funded massive rituals involving talismans, incantations, and magical diagrams. He sought rare herbs, scheduled fasts, insisted on silence and purity rituals that baffled his attendants. And, crucially, he began to consume things. Not food, not wine. Elixirs, handcrafted by palace alchemists. These mixtures often contained minerals like cinnabar and realgar, both mercury and arsenic-based substances believed to prolong life. These potions, cloaked in Taoist mystery, were meant to elevate the emperor toward divine status. In reality, they poisoned him slowly. Jiajing became increasingly erratic. He was prone to mood swings, paranoia, insomnia. His health declined, even as his belief in the elixirs deepened. Because in a universe governed by ritual, the failure of an immortality potion wasn't the potion's fault. It was yours, for not being pious enough. To support his rituals, Jiajing ordered dozens of palace maids, some barely adolescents, to remain chaste and pure, to prepare his sacred substances, and to maintain an environment of ritual cleanliness. In practice, this meant intense surveillance, long hours, silence, and constant fear. Some accounts suggest he used these girls in rituals meant to replenish his yang energy. That phrase appears in official records, vague, coded, and ominous. It's not hard to see where this leads. In 1542, after years of serving the emperor's increasingly bizarre and isolating demands, a group of palace maids had had enough. One night, while preparing his bedchamber, several of them conspired to kill him, their weapon, a silken cord. They nearly succeeded. The assassination attempt was clumsy. The emperor lost consciousness, but one of the younger maids panicked and confessed. Jia Jing survived. The conspirators did not. Punishments were swift, brutal, and ceremonial. Even the empress was implicated, some say unfairly, and executed. Historians now refer to it as the Renyan Palace Plot, and it is a strange moment of palace politics boiling over into actual rebellion from the lowest-ranking members of the inner court. And yet, even this didn't change Jia Jing's habits. He doubled down. After recovering, he withdrew even further from court life. He spent his days at the Temple of the Sun and the Temple of Heaven, obsessing over star charts and alchemical texts. Memorials from officials went unread. Provinces ran themselves. Corruption grew. Famine struck. Pirates attacked the coast. The bureaucracy begged him to intervene. He declined. He was busy becoming immortal. It's one of the strangest paradoxes of Chinese imperial history. One of the longest reigning Ming emperors also governed the least. And yet, his reign left a mark, not because of policy, but because of architecture, ritual design, and the strange aftertaste of power misused. The Forbidden City still bears traces of his renovations, designed to support his ritual needs rather than administrative functions. Entire wings were redesigned not for ministers, but for alchemical labs and silent corridors. In the public record, he is remembered as eccentric, disconnected, and possibly deluded. But in Taoist terms, Jia Jing wasn't failing. He was ascending. His focus was not the empire, but the cosmos. Not the people, but the spirits. He died in 1567. Not immortal, not divine, not remembered with affection. Some believe the very elixirs meant to grant him eternity slowly corroded his body from within. Others think he simply died of old age, stubborn to the end. But maybe the real mystery isn't why he thought he could cheat death, but why everyone else let him try. Why didn't his court remove him? Why didn't the bureaucracy demand accountability? Why didn't anyone pull the ritual incense away from his face and say, "Sire, the empire is on fire"? Because you don't interrupt the emperor when he's trying to become a god. Because when a monarch decides he's no longer human, he takes the rules of politics with him. And because in imperial China, sometimes governance was a performance, and Jia Jing, for all his isolation, knew the stage better than anyone. He made his madness look like mysticism, made his withdrawal look like elevation, turned poison into sacrament, turned a dying body into a blueprint for heaven. And long after his death, generations of officials would try to reassert order on the chaos he left behind. A reminder that no matter how high a ruler climbs toward the stars, someone always has to clean up the palace afterward. But if Jia Jing's alchemical theater felt like escapism disguised as empire, the next emperor took a very different approach. He embraced theater as domination itself, not to escape power, but to weaponize it in the most absurd, humiliating way possible. And his co-star? A horse, sort of. 6. Caligula, the horse, consul, that wasn't. Power corrupts, they say. Absolute power gives your horse a job in the Senate. Or at least, that's how the story goes. The Roman Emperor Caligula has become a byword for imperial excess, madness, cruelty, decadence. But perhaps the most iconic and enduring legend surrounding his reign is that he tried to appoint his favorite horse, Incitatus, as a consul, the highest elected office in the Roman Republic. Even schoolchildren learn it as the punchline. He made his horse a consul. Except, no, he didn't. Modern historians are quick to clarify. There's no solid evidence that Incitatus was ever actually appointed consul. The sources never agree, and the most likely scenario is that this wasn't an actual appointment, but a threat, a calculated insult to the Roman Senate, a performance of disdain cloaked in sarcasm. Which, in a way, is even worse. But to understand why that matters, you have to understand Caligula. Born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, he was the great-grandson of Augustus, Rome's first emperor. Caligula was a nickname, meaning little boots, given to him by soldiers during his childhood in military camps. He hated it, the people loved it, and eventually, so did history. He came to power in 37 CE, following the death of Tiberius, whose reign was famously paranoid, repressive, and, frankly, exhausting. At first, the Roman people adored Caligula. He was young, handsome, charismatic, the heir of a beloved general, Germanicus. Statues went up, coins were minted, festivals declared. But within a year, things began to change, rapidly. The traditional narrative says he suffered a serious illness, possibly a seizure disorder, or an infection, or something more neurological, and that the experience changed him. After recovering, he emerged different, harsher, bolder, more erratic, less patient with the Senate, less tethered to Roman traditions. But this assumes there was a before and after, when really, the through line in Caligula's reign was always control and spectacle. He didn't just want obedience. He wanted submission dressed up as irony. He wanted reverence that looked like mockery, and mockery that couldn't be called out because the audience was too scared to laugh. Which brings us back to the horse. Incitatus was no ordinary steed. According to ancient sources, Caligula had a marble stable built for him, an ivory manger, purple blankets, jewelry, guards, invitations to dinner parties. Suetonius writes that the emperor once planned to make him consul, though stops short of saying it actually happened. Cassius Dio suggests it was a joke, a bitter satire aimed at the Senate, implying they were so useless, even a horse could do their job. Imagine the scene. Roman senators in togas, stoically sitting through yet another imperial decree, only to hear that their newest colleague might be a four-legged animal who sleeps standing up and eats oats. If Caligula did indeed stage such a moment, it wasn't a sign of delusion, it was a demonstration, a performance of imperial contempt. Not, I have lost touch with reality, but you are beneath even my horse. Because here's the thing, Caligula knew the rules, he just hated them. He understood Roman decorum, the complicated dance between emperor and senate, public and private roles. He simply chose to twist those rules into surreal shapes like origami made of legal documents. And the horse was a weapon, a four-hoofed insult, a living parody. It's easy to call it madness. Historians have, for centuries. But that diagnosis is too neat, too moralizing. The ancient writers who passed down Caligula's story, Suetonius, Dio, Tacitus, although Tacitus's work on Caligula is mostly lost, were senatorial elites. They despised autocracy, especially when it mocked them. Their portraits of Caligula are as much revenge as record. Yes, Caligula's reign was short, just 4 years. And yes, it ended in assassination. But his legacy has outlived empires, not because he failed, but because he offended. He crossed a line. And Romans, famously, love lines. They invented the pomerium, the sacred boundary of the city. They believed in limits of office, of power, of behavior. Caligula ignored them all. He declared himself a living god. He held temple ceremonies in his own honor. He forced senators to grovel before him. He built bridges across bays. He wore women's clothing in public processions. He mocked Jupiter, the king of the gods, by commissioning a statue with his own face. Some sources say he threatened to make his horse a priest as well, doubling down on the sacrilege. But if you think these were the ravings of a lunatic, think again. Each act followed a pattern. Identify a sacred space, violate it, and dare anyone to stop him. And no one did. Until a conspiracy of guards and senators finally stabbed him to death in a hallway, ending his reign with the kind of brute silence Rome specialized in. But the story of Incitatus remained. Why? Because it speaks to something deeper than a quirky emperor and his favorite animal. It speaks to the fear of political impotence, to the horror of being ruled by someone who doesn't take your institutions seriously. Who can mock your systems, your hierarchies, your rules, and still win? The horse was never a consul, but the rumor was more powerful than the act. Even now, the name Incitatus is a shorthand for absurd authority, for autocrats treating government like a joke, for rulers whose mockery becomes policy. Modern scholars now see Caligula not just as a tyrant or a madman, but as a performance artist of cruelty, a cynic in a toga, someone who weaponized absurdity to demonstrate how little resistance remained. And if you're wondering why his mockery still unsettles us, it's because we haven't outgrown it. We still live in a world where strongmen drape themselves in irony, where institutions are hollowed out by pageantry, and where laughter is confused with legitimacy. Caligula may not have given his horse a Senate seat, but he proved he didn't need to. And if the idea of an emperor mocking governance through parody feels unsettling, wait until you meet the Tsar who thought pulling out people's teeth was a perfectly reasonable side project. 7. Peter the Great of Russia, the dentist Tsar. Most monarchs leave behind portraits, palaces, and political legacies. Peter the Great left behind a small but unsettling collection of human teeth. Yes, actual teeth. Labeled, catalogued, and if legends are true, personally extracted. It's the kind of footnote in history that sounds like a bad joke. A Tsar who pulled teeth for fun. But like so much in Peter's reign, the absurdity conceals something larger. A vision of power so personal, so intrusive, and so obsessed with transformation that even your molars weren't safe. Peter wasn't just a ruler. He was a project. And the subject of that project? Russia. When he took the throne, Russia was still a semi-feudal patchwork, culturally isolated from the rest of Europe and clinging to old structures like they were sacred relics. Peter looked west and saw a mirror, one that didn't include his country, so he smashed it. He spent his reign dragging Russia, often kicking and screaming, into modernity on his terms. This meant reforming the army, building a navy from scratch, rewriting court dress codes, shaving off beards, taxing old traditions, and constructing a brand new capital street, Petersburg, on swampland, just to make the point that civilization was now going to happen his way. He was relentless, brilliant, ruthless, tireless, and very, very curious. Peter loved science, not in the abstract way monarchs sometimes claim to love ideas, but in a hands-on, sleeve-rolled-up, let me take that apart and see how it works, sort of way. He wasn't content to fund exploration. He joined it. He didn't just sponsor shipbuilding. He learned how to do it. Incognito, he traveled across Europe during the famous Grand Embassy of 1697-1698, working as a shipwright in Dutch and English yards, absorbing everything he could about the mechanical, medical, and political sciences of the day. He wanted Russia to be a modern state, but he also wanted to be the kind of ruler who understood it physically, intimately, viscerally. Which brings us back to the teeth. Peter collected things, bones, specimens, anatomical oddities. He built Russia's first major museum, the Kunstkamera, and filled it with curiosities, malformed fetuses in jars, deformed animals, exotic artifacts, surgical instruments. It was part science, part propaganda. Look, it seemed to say, this is what learning looks like. This is modernity. This is Russia's future. And somewhere in that mix, a drawer of teeth. Some historians believe Peter pulled them himself, not as punishment, not as torture, as practice, as demonstration, because why merely rule a country when you could also be its amateur dentist? Eyewitness accounts describe him extracting teeth from courtiers, guards, and possibly anyone unlucky enough to catch his interest at the wrong time. Was it voluntary? Probably. After all, who refuses the Tsar? Was it medically sound? Not especially, but it was imperial science, in the way Peter understood it, empirical, invasive, and uncomfortably close to the bone. What makes this detail so bizarre is that it wasn't considered bizarre at the time. Peter's court was so transformed by his force of personality that acts which today would seem unhinged were instead interpreted as part of his larger civilizing mission. You didn't just serve Peter, you performed modernity with him. If that meant sacrificing your beard to his new grooming standards, you did it. If that meant switching from robes to breeches, you did it. If it meant opening your mouth so the Tsar could extract a molar with questionable hygiene and a curious gleam in his eye, well, that too. Because to resist, Peter wasn't just disobedience, it was regression. He governed through symbolic acts as much as policy. When he established the table of ranks, allowing commoners to rise through service rather than bloodline, he was rewriting social order. When he executed his own son Alexei, who had resisted his reforms, he was making a brutal example of what happens when the old world refuses to become new. And yes, even without graphic details, the implications of that are deeply unsettling. Peter's obsession with physical transformation wasn't just personal eccentricity, it was ideological. His reign was one long surgical procedure on the Russian state. And in surgery, you sometimes have to remove parts to save the whole. But he didn't stop at institutions. He wanted his people's bodies to match the state he was building. Hence the forced modernization of dress and grooming. Hence the museums of malformed fetuses to remind citizens of nature's chaos and the need for order. Hence the fascination with teeth. These small, organic objects that held symbolic weight. They were markers of decay, of mortality, of resistance to change. Pulling a tooth, in Peter's worldview, wasn't just a strange hobby. It was a gesture of control, over nature, over tradition, over pain, over others, even over history. Because while Peter pushed Russia forward, he was always aware that posterity would look back. He crafted his legacy with the same precision he applied to naval blueprints. He commissioned statues, rewrote ceremonial protocols, controlled narratives. He wanted to be remembered not just as a ruler, but as a founder, a creator, a craftsman of empire. And craftsmen use tools: a scalpel, a hammer, a pair of pliers. In some ways, the Kunstkamera is Peter's most honest self-portrait, not in oil or marble, but in jars and bones and enamel. A man of order, collecting the strange. A man of vision, fascinated by the malformed. A man of science who didn't fear the grotesque, but catalogued it. He wasn't the first monarch to dabble in medicine. Kings and emperors had long shown interest in anatomy, often in sanitized, symbolic ways. But Peter went further. He didn't just study the machine, he opened it, touched it, bent it to his will. He believed knowledge could be seized, not just taught, that progress could be extracted, root and all. Which brings us back, once more, to the teeth. Today, you can still see them, labeled in neat Cyrillic script, behind glass. Not glamorous, not particularly educational, just there like a signature. Peter the Great, Tsar, modernizer, navy builder, science promoter, amateur dentist. Not because he had to be, because he could. And if you think this is strange, wait until you meet the next king, who didn't just write laws or build fleets, but published an actual how-to guide for dealing with witches, demons, and the dark forces lurking just outside the rational world. 8. James VI of Scotland, Eye of England, the king who wrote a demonology manual. Long before self-help books, there was Daemonology, a 1,597 guide to identifying, understanding, and confronting the demonic forces threatening Christendom. And it wasn't written by a theologian, a clergyman, or a medieval ghost hunter. It was written by a king. James VI of Scotland, who later became James I of England, was a man obsessed with spiritual order. In an age where monarchs were already seen as divinely ordained, James went further. He wanted to be the defender of the realm, not just politically, but metaphysically. And he wasn't content to delegate that job to priests. No, James picked up a pen and declared open season on witches, warlocks, fairies, demons, and the spiritual parasites he believed were undermining the stability of both his kingdoms and his soul. His fascination didn't come from nowhere. It came from storms. In 1589, on his way back from Denmark, where he had married Anne of Denmark, James's ship was battered by violent weather. Accounts claim the storm was so severe that many believed it to be unnatural. The Danish court already had witch trials in full swing, and James, newly exposed to these ideas, took them back to Scotland with royal enthusiasm. Suddenly, the supernatural wasn't just real, it was political. The North Berwick witch trials soon followed, a terrifying series of interrogations, confessions often under torture, and executions that spun tales of covens plotting the king's death, including meetings with the devil himself. James took a personal interest in these events, not as a passive observer, but as an active participant. He questioned suspects, he read transcripts, he theorized. And then he wrote a book. Daemonology was structured as a dialogue between two characters, Philomathus, the skeptical student, and Epistemon, the all-knowing expert. It was written in formal, learned prose, steeped in references to scripture, classical mythology, and contemporary demonology. It wasn't satire, it wasn't speculative fiction. It was a sincere, reasoned argument that witchcraft was real, dangerous, and, perhaps most importantly, treasonous against God and the king. For James, the supernatural wasn't a fairy tale, it was policy. He believed witches formed pacts with the devil, that they could kill livestock, cause disease, influence the weather, and even travel invisibly through the air. But his real concern was treason, not just spiritual, but political. Witches, in his view, were agents of disorder, and James hated disorder more than almost anything else. His worldview was tightly ordered, hierarchical, and anxious. He saw the king at the top, as God's chosen intermediary on earth, and any deviation from that structure, be it political rebellion or metaphysical corruption, as an existential threat. Daemonology helped shape the witch-hunting climate of his reign. It wasn't the only influence, of course, but it carried enormous weight because it came from the king himself. Suddenly, belief in witches wasn't just tolerated, it was state-sanctioned, royally endorsed, academically framed. And ironically, this deeply superstitious book was also a reflection of James's deeply intellectual mind. He was no fool, fluent in Latin and Greek, a voracious reader, obsessed with legal theory and theological nuance. He genuinely saw witchcraft not as irrational, but as a rational danger, one supported by scripture, by precedent, by history. His enemies weren't mere peasants muttering over herbs. They were cosmic criminals, and he was their prosecutor-in-chief. When James became King of England in 1603, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland, he brought his demonological zeal with him, though, notably, he cooled over time. English witch trials did continue during his reign, but his direct involvement was less intense than in Scotland. Scholars debate why. Maybe age softened him. Maybe the English court's skepticism reined him in. Maybe the real enemy had shifted from witches to Catholics, from demons to Parliament. Still, daemonology had already left its mark. It would influence England's most infamous witch hunter, Matthew Hopkins, decades later. It helped establish a language, a framework, a set of justifications. It gave the irrational a royal signature. But here's the twist. The same man who wrote Daemonology also authorized one of the most enduring literary legacies in the English language, the King James Bible. A project of translation, standardization, and poetic reform that would shape global Christianity for centuries. Same monarch, same pen. On one side, an intellectual weapon against perceived supernatural threats. On the other, a refined literary monument to sacred order. Contradiction? Absolutely. But that was James. He believed in reason, but feared what reason couldn't explain. He promoted learning, but distrusted unregulated thought. He patronized Shakespeare, whose Macbeth plays like a theatrical companion to daemonology, and also saw theater as potentially subversive. He wanted a perfectly ordered world, but lived in a violently chaotic one. So he did what all anxious rulers do. He tried to write his way out of it. And daemonology wasn't fringe. It was reprinted, studied, cited in trials. It wasn't just about witches, it was about James, crafting himself as the ultimate interpreter of danger, the one who sees the hidden rot beneath the skin of the state. His reign would be defined by this tension, between order and fear, enlightenment and anxiety, the pursuit of knowledge and the shadow of the unknown. He didn't just inherit a kingdom, he inherited a powder keg of theological tension, political division, and superstition that he alternately tried to extinguish and inflame. Even his death is laced with symbolism. He died in 1625, old, gout-ridden, and paranoid, convinced of plots, surrounded by shadows. Remembered as both a king of peace and the king who legalized paranoia. And the legacy of daemonology? It lingers. Not as science, not even as theology, but as a reminder that power, when fused with fear, can intellectualize almost anything, that a book written by a king can turn suspicion into law. That reason itself can be weaponized when the person holding the pen believes deeply in invisible enemies. And if James's fears about witches seem outdated, consider this. We still live in a world of conspiracies dressed up as research, of strong men publishing manifestos against unseen foes. We haven't outgrown the urge to turn personal paranoia into national doctrine. We've just updated the language. And if a demon-hunting king with a printing press sounds odd, wait until you meet the emperor who decided his capital city would be a laboratory of the weird, a place where astrology, alchemy, and art fused into one surreal court of wonders. 9. Rudolph II, Holy Roman Emperor, Prague as an occult laboratory. History likes its rulers in categories: wise or foolish, enlightened or mad, tyrant or saint. But Rudolph II, Holy Roman Emperor, from 1576 to 1612, dodges every neat label. He ruled the largest political entity in Europe and turned its heart Prague into a swirling laboratory of the strange. Not a military capital, not a bureaucratic center, a gallery, a dream, a science experiment, an occult theater. He was not a king who unified or conquered. He did not march armies or reform taxes. His legacy is not a map of battles or a list of treaties. It's a list of names, artists, alchemists, astrologers, clockmakers, occultists, inventors, mathematicians, and magicians drawn from every corner of Europe to feed his obsession with knowing everything. Rudolph II didn't want to rule the world. He wanted to understand it. And so, he turned his imperial court into something completely bizarre. A cross between a Renaissance think tank, a magical theme park, and a cosmic scavenger hunt. Under his patronage, Prague became the European capital of wonder, and perhaps, quietly, the capital of unease. From the outside, it might have looked like decadence, or eccentricity, or a rich man's indulgence. But inside the walls of Hradčany Castle, something more intricate was unfolding. Rudolph collected geniuses, and misfits, and people who were both. He summoned Tycho Brahe, the greatest naked-eye astronomer of the age, to refine celestial calculations. He hosted Johannes Kepler, whose elliptical orbits would one day overturn centuries of planetary thinking. He patronized the botanist Charles de Lecluse, whose catalogs changed how Europe thought about plants. He corresponded with astronomers, physicians, clockmakers, and not just scientists, painters too, mythmakers, visionaries, anyone who might crack open the shell of reality. But he didn't just want answers. He wanted beauty. He wanted strange objects, mechanical animals, living automata, mirrored halls, timepieces with no obvious function, cabinets that opened into other cabinets, worlds inside drawers, microcosms. Because Rudolph wasn't just building a court, he was building a universe. The Kunstkammer, or Cabinet of Curiosities, was his centerpiece, a collection of rare objects, artistic masterpieces, medical anomalies, alchemical tools, minerals, fossils, astrological charts, religious icons, and things that didn't fit any known category. It was, in many ways, the internet before the internet, an attempt to hold all knowledge, all mystery, all contradiction in one place. And it reflected him perfectly. Vast, unclassifiable, riddled with meaning and paranoia. Rudolph believed in astrology as deeply as others believed in politics. He saw the movements of the stars as direct commentary on his soul, his destiny, his empire. He surrounded himself with horoscopes, lunar predictions, and birth charts. When he made decisions, it was less about counsel than about celestial alignment. His court rituals were deeply symbolic, often confusing, sometimes entirely made up. Titles and honors didn't always mean what they were supposed to. Appearances deceived. People moved in and out of favor like phases of the moon. You didn't just visit Rudolph's court, you got absorbed by it. But beneath the glitter of wonder, there was anxiety. Rudolph was reclusive, unmarried, moody. He struggled with depression, periods of paralysis, and long retreats into privacy. He was obsessed with the occult, not just as entertainment, but as solution. He didn't want to study reality, he wanted to change it, to unlock secrets hidden in the natural world, to transform base matter into gold, to find elixirs that would prolong life, quiet pain, calm the mind. Alchemy wasn't a metaphor to him, it was a strategy. He funded alchemists in droves, real ones, fraudulent ones, somewhere in between. They filled laboratories across Prague with their bubbling experiments, coded manuscripts, and strange, acrid fumes. And Rudolf watched it all, closely, hungrily, not because he was irrational, because he was desperate. He lived in a world of instability, religious conflict, dynastic rivalry, political fragmentation, and he tried to replace it with a world of hidden order. He didn't trust human systems. He trusted patterns, symbols, nature as machine, and the people who seemed to have the tools to unlock it. That's why he collected them, not for glory, for control. But control is a slippery thing. While he lost himself in theories and wonders, the empire frayed. Protestant and Catholic tensions deepened. Administrators complained. His own family whispered that he was unfit. By the early 1600s, his brother Matthias had effectively taken over much of the political management, and Rudolf was pushed into symbolic exile inside his own palace, still surrounded by wonders, still asking for the stars. He died in 1612, shortly after being forced to abdicate the crown of Bohemia. A man who had built the most intellectually eclectic court in Europe, buried by the same forces he had tried to escape: politics, family, war, reality. The Prague he left behind would never be the same. His collections were looted, scattered. Some were sold, some lost in war. Some remain in museums, mislabeled, mysterious. Tiny fragments of a dream that once spanned continents and cosmologies. Today, scholars still argue, was Rudolf a genius patron, a depressive recluse, a mystic in royal drag? The truth is somewhere in the middle, wrapped in velvet and ash. What's undeniable is this: he redefined what it meant to be a ruler. He didn't build an empire of borders, he built one of symbols. He thought being an emperor meant not managing power, but mapping the universe by hand, if necessary. And what's stranger still, in his own strange way, he succeeded. Because centuries later, we are still fascinated, still trying to understand what, exactly, he was looking for in those jars and charts and books of gold-leafed gibberish, still haunted by the possibility that he almost saw something real. A hidden structure, a secret language, a theory of everything. And if a court of alchemists, astrologers, and mad geniuses sounds like the ultimate imperial eccentricity, wait until you meet the king who decided castles weren't good enough, so he built a fairy tale instead, one turret at a time. 10. King Ludwig II of Bavaria, the fairy tale king who built his fantasies. Most kings commissioned fortresses. Ludwig II of Bavaria commissioned hallucinations, in stone. If Charles VI thought he was made of glass, and Rudolf II tried to decode the universe with crystals and constellations, Ludwig II of Bavaria tried something different. He built his delusions into architecture. Not metaphorically, literally. With towers, stained glass, moats, artificial grottos, operatic balconies, and fantastical murals depicting swans, knights, angels, and gods. Structures that seemed not to belong to any known time period, yet had the precision and expense of industrial age engineering. Ludwig didn't just dream in color, he dreamt in floor plans. And then he made the rest of Bavaria pay for it. Born in 1845 and crowned king at just 18, Ludwig was the head of the Wittelsbach dynasty during a time when monarchs across Europe were nervously watching the ground shift beneath their thrones. Prussia was consolidating power. The German Empire was on the rise. Constitutional monarchies were trimming back royal authority. And Ludwig, an intensely private, romantic young man, wanted absolutely nothing to do with the practical side of kingship. What he wanted was Wagner. Specifically, the composer Richard Wagner, whose operas about Germanic myths, doomed love, and divine struggle left Ludwig breathless. He became Wagner's patron, benefactor, and obsessive admirer. Their correspondence reads like a mixture of diplomatic telegram and fan mail. Wagner needed a paycheck. Ludwig needed magic. And so the young king began to retreat from politics, from court life, from statecraft, and into art, into fantasy, into architectural reverie. His most famous creation is Neuschwanstein Castle, perched high in the Bavarian Alps, with spires reaching through clouds like some kind of alpine Atlantis. Construction began in 1868. It was never finished in Ludwig's lifetime. The castle wasn't designed for defense. It wasn't designed for court life, or for entertaining dignitaries, or for any of the functions castles were historically meant to serve. Neuschwanstein was built for one audience, Ludwig himself. It was a theater, a dreamscape, a performance of monarchy with no plot, just stage. Every room was designed to reflect a specific mythological scene or musical reference. The walls of the Singers' Hall were decorated with stories from the legend of Parsifal. The throne room shimmered with Byzantine mosaics but lacked an actual throne, as if the idea of divine kingship had been elevated to abstraction. He even had a man-made cave built inside, a sort of romantic grotto between rooms, complete with dripping water and mood lighting. And all of this, you might ask, for whom? No one. Ludwig lived there alone. He had a habit of dining in solitude, sending food up by dumbwaiter so he wouldn't have to see his servants. He often stayed up all night and slept during the day. He composed elaborate fantasy letters to Wagner, staged mock performances in the castle halls, and filled his life with ritualized theatrical solitude. He built Linderhof, another palace smaller but even more decadent, modeled after Versailles, complete with a hall of mirrors, peacock feather ceilings, and a private Venus grotto, where he could float on a swan boat under artificial stars. He later began construction on Herrenchiemsee, an even more lavish Versailles-inspired palace on an island. Because if you're going to disappear from political life, you may as well do it on a lake. This was not ruling. This was performance art with a crown. Of course, it couldn't last. Ludwig's building projects drained the Bavarian treasury. Though he mostly used his own personal funds, and later, personal loans, the financial strain created enormous tension with his ministers. He borrowed against future revenues. He demanded more credit. His cabinet grew anxious. But how do you confront a monarch who refuses to attend cabinet meetings, who rides alone at night through the mountains, who communicates through poetic notes, and avoids all state business like it's a contagious disease? The answer: very carefully. In 1886, his ministers staged what can only be described as a polite coup. They declared Ludwig mentally unfit to rule. No public trial, no dramatic speech. Just a medical report written in absentia, with testimony from people who hadn't seen Ludwig in years diagnosing him with paranoia and mental instability. They sent a commission to arrest him. It worked. Ludwig was taken into custody and placed under supervision at Castle Berg. Days later, he and his supervising psychiatrist went for a walk near the lake. Hours passed. Neither returned. Their bodies were later found in shallow water. Officially, accidental drowning. Unofficially, everyone still disagrees. The mystery of Ludwig's death haunts Bavarian history. Did he attempt escape and drown? Did he murder the doctor and then take his own life? Was it a staged accident? An assassination? We'll never know. The lake doesn't talk. But his castles still stand. Neuschwanstein, though unfinished, remains one of the most visited landmarks in Europe. It was the architectural inspiration for Disneyland's Sleeping Beauty Castle, perhaps the most fitting posthumous compliment Ludwig could have ever received. His dream palace became the global symbol of fantasy, of fairy tales, of imagined royalty. Ludwig was mocked in his time. The Mad King, they called him. But history has been kinder. Some now see him not as insane, but as intentionally anachronistic, a man so overwhelmed by modernity that he chose to live in deliberate, exquisite denial. He didn't fight history, he fled it, and left behind a dream so solid you can walk through it. So what was he, really? A failed monarch? An artist trapped in the wrong job? A martyr of beauty? A man too sensitive for the world that demanded he lead it? All of them. None of them. That's the mystery. Because in the end, Ludwig built something no coup could dismantle. He made unreality last. He carved fantasy into the cliffs and valleys of Bavaria, and by doing so, he flipped the whole script on monarchy. Not a ruler who governed the land, but one who replaced it. Not a king of people, but a king of dreams. And if Ludwig made his mark by withdrawing into art, the next queen on our journey went the other way, refusing her crown entirely, abandoning her throne, and choosing a life of books, letters, and scandalous freedom. 11. Christina, Queen of Sweden, the abdication that stunned Europe. Every monarch is taught one lesson above all. You do not walk away. Thrones are not jobs. They are identities. Monarchs don't resign. They reign until death, scandal, or revolution rips the crown from their heads. But in 1654, Christina, Queen of Sweden, did something nearly unthinkable. She gave it all up. Voluntarily, publicly, with a flair that still baffles historians and delights playwrights. Born in 1626 to King Gustavus Adolphus, Sweden's most celebrated warrior king, and his consort Maria Eleonora of Brandenburg, Christina came into the world during war. Her father died in battle when she was just 6 years old, leaving her the sole legitimate heir to the Swedish throne. She was immediately declared king in all but name, crowned with the understanding that she would one day rule not as a consort, not as a figurehead, but as a sovereign. And from the start, she refused to be what anyone expected. By all accounts, Christina was brilliant, exceptionally educated, fluent in multiple languages, conversant in theology, philosophy, literature, politics, and classical studies. She devoured books, collected art, held salons. She corresponded with Descartes. She studied the great thinkers of antiquity not just to quote them, but to live among them intellectually. Her court in Stockholm was an island of scholarship in a sea of Protestant austerity. But brilliance came with friction. She resisted the roles laid out for her. She refused to marry, despite immense pressure from her council, her nobility, and every foreign diplomat looking for a royal match. She dressed in ways considered eccentric for a queen, sometimes in male-coded attire, often in rich fabrics that scandalized the somber court. She walked and spoke with deliberate confidence, and wrote of herself in ways that blurred the lines of gendered identity and royal expectation. If Gustavus Adolphus was the Lion of the North, Christina was the Sphinx, mysterious, paradoxical, unreadable. And politically, she played her role well at first. She upheld the Protestant identity of the state, maintained alliances, oversaw Sweden's continued status as a European power, and managed her increasingly frustrated council with a mix of charm, intelligence, and occasional indifference. But by her late 20s, it became clear that Christina was not planning to reign forever. She had no interest in marriage, no plans for an heir, and most crucially, no desire to remain in Sweden. Something in her pulled south, to the continent, to Rome, to the intellectual and spiritual world beyond her snow-covered borders. In 1654, after years of hinting and resisting pressure, Christina formally abdicated the throne. The ceremony was as strange as it was unprecedented. She removed her crown, her scepter, and royal garments before the court, and walked away from monarchy itself. Her cousin, Charles X. Gustav, took the throne. The line continued. But Christina's story didn't end. It began. After leaving Sweden, she converted secretly at first, then dramatically to Catholicism. This was not a trivial move. Sweden was a fiercely Protestant nation, forged in the fires of the Reformation. Her father had died fighting Catholic forces in the 30 Years' War. Her advisors had spent years trying to ensure her orthodoxy. Her court had been a showcase of Lutheran morality. Her conversion was seen by many in Sweden as a betrayal. But to Christina, it was liberation. She moved to Rome and reinvented herself entirely, not as an exiled queen, but as a philosopher queen, a patron of the arts, a cultural force. She was received in the Vatican with the kind of theatrical ceremony usually reserved for saints or generals. Her entry was choreographed to the last detail. Rome, always hungry for spectacle, embraced her as both prize and curiosity. A Protestant queen turned Catholic intellectual, a living paradox. She established a court in exile, one of the most sophisticated and cosmopolitan of the 17th century. Artists, writers, composers, and scholars flocked to her. She funded scientific research. She attended and hosted philosophical debates. She supported theater and music. She advised popes and princes. And she stayed deeply, proudly unconventional. She wrote about love and beauty and spiritual transformation. She expressed complex views about gender, power, identity, and faith. She dismissed traditional roles, describing herself in letters and memoirs with terms that resisted classification. She never married. She left behind few firm declarations and many fascinating contradictions. One of the enduring mysteries of her life is how she saw herself. Some read her as a proto-feminist, rejecting the narrow expectations of queenship and womanhood. Others see a political strategist, using abdication and conversion to gain freedom and influence. Still others see a restless soul, a person whose intellect could not be confined by any one identity, whose needs changed faster than her titles could keep up. Her reputation across Europe was mixed. In Protestant lands, she was regarded with suspicion, even derision, an apostate, a runaway queen, a symbol of moral instability. In Catholic courts, she was admired but also used a kind of glamorous trophy in the long ideological war with Protestantism. She died in 1689, in Rome, without fanfare, but with her dignity intact. She was buried in St. Peter's Basilica, one of the few women to receive that honor. Today, her legacy is less about politics and more about defiance. She remains one of the few monarchs in history to voluntarily abandon the throne and reject nearly every conventional expectation placed upon her. Not in the name of love, not in the name of scandal, but in the name of self-direction, which might be the most scandalous reason of all. Christina's story is unsettling because it flips the entire logic of monarchy. The crown, we are told, is the ultimate goal, the end point, the reward for birth, ambition, destiny. But for Christina, the crown was a costume, an act she walked away from without regret. She reminds us that sometimes the most radical thing a ruler can do is stop ruling, not because they failed, but because they outgrew the role. She didn't die a martyr. She didn't fall to rebellion. She didn't fade into obscurity. She pivoted. She turned a throne into a platform, then into a stage, then into a suitcase, and took her show to Rome. And if Christina stunned Europe by walking away from her royal identity, the next emperor we meet did the opposite. He dove so deeply into his own that he began performing it in public arenas, half divine, half gladiator wearing the pelt of Hercules, and demanding applause like a god-king on tour. 12. Commodus emperor by day, Hercules in the arena. Rome had seen spectacle before. Triumphs, parades, games, gladiators, pageantry so loud it shook the marble. But it had never seen this, an emperor who stepped into the spectacle and refused to step back out. Commodus, son of the philosopher-emperor Marcus Aurelius, inherited the most powerful position in the ancient world in 180 CE. The problem wasn't that he lacked authority. It was that he lacked restraint, and rather than hide that fact behind laws or speeches, he put it on stage, dressed in lion skins, wielding props, and demanding applause. If Christina of Sweden abandoned the crown to find herself, Commodus wore the crown to become someone else entirely. From the beginning, Commodus was a disappointment to those who loved his father's legacy. Marcus Aurelius had embodied stoic restraint, duty over desire, philosophy over pleasure. Commodus embodied none of that. Where his father wrote meditations on virtue, Commodus preferred physical display, sensation, and recognition. He wanted to be seen, to be cheered, to be feared, adored, and worshipped. And above all, he wanted to be Hercules. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. Commodus styled himself as the living incarnation of the demigod. He commissioned statues of himself wearing a lion's pelt and carrying a club. He renamed Rome's months after his own titles. He insisted official documents refer to him as Hercules Romanus. Coins were struck bearing his divine image. Temples honored him not as a ruler, but as a god walking among mortals. This alone would have unsettled Rome. But Commodus went further. He entered the arena. Now, to be clear, Roman emperors did not fight as gladiators. Gladiatorial combat was a profession associated with slaves, prisoners, and the socially marginal. It was entertainment built on hierarchy. Citizens watched, elites presided. The emperor symbolized order above it all. Commodus shattered that separation. He appeared in the arena repeatedly, staging combat performances in front of massive crowds. According to ancient sources, these displays were carefully controlled. His opponents were often poorly armed, or trained to lose, but the symbolism was unmistakable. The emperor had descended into the arena, not as a patron, but as the star attraction. Rome didn't know how to process it. Some cheered, some were horrified. Senators sat stiffly, applauding on cue, knowing that insufficient enthusiasm could be interpreted as disloyalty. The crowd roared, because crowds always roar. But beneath the noise, anxiety simmered. Because the emperor wasn't just performing strength, he was erasing boundaries. Commodus treated the arena like a stage, not a battlefield. He killed animals as part of elaborate spectacles, framing himself as a heroic conqueror of nature. He strutted, he posed, he soaked in adulation. And then, after the show, he returned to the palace as if nothing unusual had happened. This wasn't recreation, it was ideology. By performing as Hercules, Commodus wasn't just seeking applause. He was rewriting the relationship between power and performance. He was saying, I am not bound by your traditions. I am not just emperor. I am myth. And Rome hated that. The Senate despised him, not just because of his excesses, but because of what they represented. The Republic's old values, dignity, restraint, hierarchy, were being mocked in public. The emperor wasn't above the crowd anymore. He was courting it, performing for it, feeding off it. Power had become celebrity. And celebrity, as Rome well understood, was volatile. Ancient historians portray Commodus as erratic, self-indulgent, and detached from governance. While he staged spectacles, others ran the empire often poorly. Corruption flourished. Favoritism determined appointments. Policy drifted. Assassination plots multiplied. But it would be a mistake to view Commodus as simply incompetent. He understood something deeply unsettling. That spectacle could replace legitimacy. That if the crowd loved him or feared him enough, institutions didn't matter. This is why the arena mattered so much. It was Rome's emotional center, its pressure valve, its collective mirror, and Commodus stood at the center of it, controlling the narrative. Even his enemies had to admit, the people watched. He didn't rule through law, he ruled through theater. And like all performers who confuse applause with loyalty, Commodus became increasingly detached from reality. He trusted flatterers. He alienated allies. He believed his own mythology. By the end of his reign, he was reportedly planning to rename Rome itself after his divine identity, turning the city into a monument to himself. But myth has a shelf life. In 192 CE, after a series of conspiracies and mounting instability, Commodus was killed in a palace plot involving members of his inner circle. His death was quiet, unceremonious, no arena. No audience, no applause. The empire moved on quickly. The Senate condemned his memory. Statues were destroyed. His name was erased from inscriptions. Official history painted him as a monster, a clown, a tyrant. And yet, his image endured, because Commodus represented something Rome feared, but could not unsee. A ruler who understood power as performance, who turned governance into entertainment, who collapsed the distance between authority and spectacle. The gladiator emperor wasn't just a freakish anomaly. He was a warning. That politics, when stripped of restraint, becomes theater. That leaders who crave applause will eventually demand worship. That institutions are fragile when confronted by charisma armed with violence and spectacle. Modern historians now approach Commodus with more nuance. They question the reliability of hostile senatorial sources. They note that his arena performances were symbolic, not suicidal. They suggest he may have seen himself as renewing Roman vitality through physical dominance and divine association. But even with all that revision, the core remains. Commodus wanted to be seen as more than human, and he wanted Rome to participate in that illusion. He succeeded briefly. And then, the illusion collapsed. The empire survived, barely. But the precedent lingered. that an emperor could redefine himself not as administrator, but as icon, not as ruler, but as spectacle. And if Commodus turned himself into a god on stage, the next king we meet was turned into something else entirely by his own court, by his own body, and by whispers of curses that transformed a living monarch into a medical mystery wrapped in superstition. 13. Charles II of Spain, the bewitched and medical mystery monarchy. You can read an entire century of Spanish history through the body of one man, and not a healthy one. By the time Charles II of Spain took the throne in 1665, the Habsburg dynasty had produced rulers, warriors, emperors, and queens across Europe. But Charles would be something else, a cautionary tale written in flesh and fear. The final act of a bloodline so tangled, so medically compromised, and so politically burdened, that when he finally died in 1700, it wasn't just a man who collapsed, it was an empire. He was called El Hechizado, the Bewitched. Even in his lifetime, people didn't just see him as sick, they saw him as cursed. And in a way, they were right. Charles II was the product of generations of inbreeding within the Spanish Habsburg dynasty, where preserving royal bloodlines took precedence over genetic diversity. His mother was the niece of his father. His family tree looked less like a branching structure and more like a tightly looped spiral. It wasn't just dynasty, it was recursion. The result was a child born with a catalog of physical and cognitive issues, pronounced jaw deformities, delayed development, chronic illness, and possible intellectual disability. Modern historians and geneticists have suggested he may have suffered from multiple inherited disorders, but even they struggle to piece together a full diagnosis, because Charles II wasn't just a medical case, he was a myth in real time. Accounts of his early life describe a boy who couldn't walk or talk properly until well into childhood, who suffered frequent seizures and digestive issues, who was often bedridden, who aged slowly, whose body never seemed to catch up to his role, and yet he was king. Because in monarchy, biology is second to succession. Whether your crown fits is less important than whether your blood is certified, and Charles had the blood, just not much else. He came to the throne at age 4, after the death of his father, Philip IV. A regency governed in his name first his mother, Mariana of Austria, then a rotating cast of nobles and bishops, all jostling for control over a kingdom that was already unraveling. Spain's political power had declined dramatically by the late 17th century. Its military strength was fading, its finances were a shambles. But instead of focusing on reforms, much of the court focused on Charles's body, studying it, worrying over it, praying for it, blaming it, and eventually suspecting it had been cursed. The bewitchment explanation didn't start as metaphor. It was literal. Court factions, frustrated by Charles's weakness and sterility, began to suspect supernatural interference. How else to explain a king so frail, so haunted, so unable to fulfill the most basic dynastic duties? Soon, exorcists were summoned. Priests performed purification rituals. Monks whispered of black masses, evil eyes, and satanic plots. There are records of full-scale investigations into possible witchcraft against the king's person. One prominent confessor even wrote reports arguing that Charles had been victimized by demonic forces. It wasn't just superstition, it was politics. When you can't challenge the structure of monarchy, you challenge the air around it. If the king isn't healthy, it must be the devil's fault. That way, no one has to admit the deeper truth, that the system itself is breaking down. And Charles? He played his part, whether knowingly or not. He grew into a melancholy figure, physically weak and emotionally erratic. His famous Habsburg jaw was so pronounced he could barely chew. His speech was slurred. His limbs often didn't coordinate. He had little education and less interest in statecraft. He was said to be sweet-tempered but easily manipulated, increasingly isolated, and subject to religious mania. He married twice. Neither marriage produced children. Court physicians alternated between prayers and potions. Political rivals whispered that the king was impotent. Some even said he wasn't really a man at all. His body became the main arena of dynastic anxiety, a failing instrument everyone blamed and no one could repair. As Charles aged, The rumors intensified. In one bizarre episode, he allegedly ordered his own dead relatives to be exhumed and examined for signs of magical tampering. In another, he reportedly underwent a series of exorcisms so elaborate they read like theater scripts, complete with holy relics, invocations, and audiences of nervous nobles. All the while, Spain drifted. Colonies weakened, the treasury emptied. Europe watched carefully, knowing that when Charles died without an heir, the question of succession would tear the continent apart. It was no longer just a matter of one fragile king. It was a matter of who would control the Spanish crown, France or Austria, Bourbon or Habsburg, and what war that question would spark. Charles, perhaps sensing the pressure, tried to name a successor. He changed his mind several times, encouraged by various factions. He signed his final will shortly before his death, naming Philip of Anjou, the grandson of Louis XIV of France, as his heir. That decision would ignite the War of the Spanish Succession and redraw the map of Europe. But Charles didn't live to see it. He died on the 1st of November, 1700, at the age of 38. Old for his condition, young by royal standards. A man who had been king for almost 4 decades, and yet left behind almost no legacy of action, only of endurance. His autopsy was macabre, and possibly exaggerated. His body, they claimed, was full of water, his heart, the size of a peppercorn, his lungs, corroded, his intestines, rotted, and his head, full of fluid. Whether those details are accurate or theatrical, they captured what the court had believed all along, that Charles II wasn't just ill, but cursed, a vessel for centuries of dynastic ambition finally collapsing under its own weight. But the real tragedy of Charles II isn't his health. It's how completely his body became the battlefield of empire. He was not allowed to be a person. He was a symbol, a prophecy, a warning. His symptoms were translated into omens. His silence became a canvas for conspiracy. He was dissected by theologians, doctors, courtiers, and diplomats, not to help him, but to figure out what he meant. Because Charles wasn't just the last Habsburg king of Spain. He was the last illusion. The illusion that bloodlines are invincible, that monarchy can outrun biology, that a divine right is enough to keep a kingdom from slipping into decay. His body said otherwise. And if Charles's story makes you uneasy, it should. It asks the uncomfortable question: what happens when a government depends entirely on the body of a man who can't stand? And worse, what happens when everyone agrees to pretend he can? But if Charles II's reign was defined by the body failing in silence, the next king's body would explode into public spectacle, turning private agony into a national event, with the entire country watching a medical operation that no one could ignore. 14. Louis XIV of France, the surgery that became national spectacle. Louis XIV was not a man who did things halfway. He was the Sun King, after all, center of gravity for the known universe, or at least the French-speaking portion of it. Monarch of magnificence, architect of Versailles, embodiment of divine right politics turned into architecture and etiquette. His every step was choreographed, his waking breath rehearsed, his wardrobe a ritual. He reigned for over 72 years, longer than any other European monarch, across a period that transformed France into a cultural, military, and political powerhouse. And in 1686, all of it came to a very literal, very painful, very awkward halt. The most powerful man in Europe had a problem he couldn't ignore: a painful anal fistula. And if you're wondering what an anal fistula is, don't. Just know this: it's painful, it's intimate, and in the 17th century, it was a surgical nightmare. This was not a moment history was built to handle. Kings die in battle. They issue proclamations. They undergo coronations. They do not, as a rule, undergo invasive surgery on one of the most private areas of the human body, while half the royal court waits just outside the curtains, trying not to faint. But Louis was no ordinary king, and this was no ordinary operation. First, the lead-up. Louis had been experiencing discomfort for months, pain while sitting, recurring infections, general irritation. His physicians, beholden to outdated Galenic methods and royal modesty, tried everything short of surgery: enemas, bloodletting, herbal compresses, mystical balms. Nothing worked. Eventually, it became clear. Something had to be done. And not just for Louis's health, but for France's symbolic order. Because Louis XIV was not just a person, he was the body politic itself. In the logic of absolutism, the king's body and the state's body were the same. If he was in pain, France was in pain. If he failed to function, governance stalled. The court couldn't move forward while the king winced every time he sat down. So, surgery. This was not a simple decision. In 1686, surgical practice was still fighting for legitimacy. Surgery was considered a lower art than medicine, more mechanical, more dangerous, more associated with barbers than scholars. Most surgeons operated on the poor, the injured, or the desperate, not monarchs. Enter Charles-François Félix de Tassy, a barber surgeon with ambition, some talent, and a growing reputation. He was appointed royal surgeon with one job: fix the king's problem without killing the king. No pressure. Félix, to his credit, didn't rush in. He practiced first, on prisoners, seriously. He found volunteers from Paris jails, offered pardons in exchange for being guinea pigs in developing a procedure that had rarely been attempted with success. Trial after trial, failures, modifications. Eventually, a new surgical instrument was designed specifically for the operation, shaped like a curved blade with a safety groove. It became known as the fistula bisturi. And then, on the 18th of November, 1686, the surgery was performed. Without modern anesthesia, without antiseptic, without any guarantee that the king would survive. Louis reportedly bore the operation with stoic calm, though accounts vary wildly. What's clear is that it worked. The fistula was successfully treated. Recovery took months, but the king lived, and so did the monarchy's image. And then things got even weirder. Louis XIV, in what can only be described as a masterstroke of absolutist PR, turned his surgery into a national event. The operation was not hidden or minimized. It was celebrated, engraved, painted, performed. Plays were written, poems composed, commemorative medals minted. The surgical instrument itself became a kind of holy relic. The king's successful recovery was framed as a divine blessing. The surgeon was rewarded with land, money, and a title. Other aristocrats soon began lining up for the same operation, many of them with no medical need, just to prove their royal loyalty or demonstrate physical courage in imitation of the king. Fistula chic had arrived. It's easy to laugh now, but there's something deeply political going on here. Louis XIV managed to turn vulnerability into strength. He took a condition that could have been humiliating, even disqualifying, and transformed it into a demonstration of his resilience, his fortitude, his closeness to his people. He suffered, just like you, but he endured, as only a king can. This was monarchy as theater, medical agony repurposed as pageantry. Louis understood, better than anyone, that kingship was a role, and roles required costume changes. This time, the costume was a surgical gown. But beneath the triumphal tone, the episode reveals something darker about absolute power. Louis XIV had to make his suffering public, not because he wanted to, but because he had no other choice. In a regime built entirely around his person, even his most private pain became a national crisis. The body that was supposed to be divine turned out to be quite mortal. It had pus, infection, and nerve endings. It failed, and the state couldn't handle that failure privately. This is the paradox of the royal body. Worshipped from afar, inspected up close. Everything Louis did, how he ate, how he woke up, how he sat down, was symbolic. Every ache had political weight. A limp meant instability. A wince meant uncertainty. So the only way forward was through spectacle. Transform suffering into narrative. Transform the surgeon into a hero. Transform a wound into propaganda. And it worked. After his recovery, Louis's popularity surged. Court factions realigned. The surgeon's reputation skyrocketed. Medical journals across Europe studied the case. And in a strange twist of fate, the field of surgery itself gained new prestige. The king's bum had become a gateway to professionalization. Later monarchs would try to keep their ailments secret, not Louis, he leaned in. By the end of his reign, he was an old man, stooped and gout-ridden, but still the center of the world. Versailles still revolved around his schedule. Ministers still waited for his nod. His very presence remained the source of legitimacy. But it's hard to forget that at the heart of that power was a man whose most famous contribution to medicine was being cut open in the name of the state. Because that's what absolutism is, in the end, the total fusion of identity and performance. The man is the crown, the pain is the realm. And if Louis turned his private medical crisis into a national drama, the next queen we meet reversed the direction, turning her grief into something even more elaborate, ritualized, and quietly disturbing. A mourning so intense, it remade her palace into a shrine where time refused to move forward. 15. Queen Victoria preserving Prince Albert's rooms like a living monument. Royal mourning is supposed to be dignified, symbolic, a black veil, a few solemn processions, perhaps the renaming of a bridge or a new statue by the river. It is not supposed to last 40 years. It is not supposed to become the central axis around which an entire life, a court, and somehow an empire quietly orbits. And it is certainly not supposed to involve laying out a fresh set of clothes every day for a man who has been dead since 1861. But then again, Queen Victoria was not in the business of supposed to. When Prince Albert died at the age of 42, the effect on Victoria was not simply emotional, it was structural. The entire architecture of her daily existence collapsed. And rather than rebuild, she preserved rebuilding nothing, remaking no rituals, resisting every polite suggestion to move on. She didn't mourn her husband so much as canonize him, transforming him from consort into a kind of household deity whose presence was staged, felt, reenacted, and, above all, meticulously curated. In the years following his death, she transformed entire rooms into memory theaters. At Windsor, Balmoral, and Osborne House, Albert's clothes were laid out as if he might return. Fresh hot water was brought to his wash basin every morning. His shaving gear was cleaned and arranged. His bed linens changed. Fresh towels, slippers placed precisely, clocks were wound. Curtains adjusted. His desk preserved exactly as he'd left it. No one sat in his chair. No one moved his pen. This wasn't Victorian sentimentality. This was something colder, sharper, a kind of controlled haunting. Victoria, the Queen of England and Empress of India, was living inside a shrine of her own design. And the British Empire kept functioning around it. Publicly, she wore mourning clothes for the rest of her life, decades of black silks and jet jewelry, her figure slowly shrinking within layers of fabric. The mourning dress became her second skin, her portable altar. To appear in anything else would have been, to her mind, betrayal. She even specified in her will that she was to be buried with Albert's dressing gown, one of his handkerchiefs, and a plaster cast of his hand. But it was the rooms, those still, dustless, unused rooms, that formed the most surreal and unsettling tribute. Because they weren't just for her. They were for everyone. Visitors to the royal residences found themselves walking through spaces frozen in time. Servants maintained Albert's quarters with military precision. No one referred to them as relics, but that's what they were. Not objects of memory, but physical manifestations of denial. This wasn't simple grief. It was imperial mourning scaled up to the dimensions of myth-making. Victoria didn't want to let go of Albert, and so she built a lifestyle in which she never had to. She turned her loss into a function of state, made it part of her identity. If the queen was to be a widow, then the entire monarchy would reflect that widowhood. The effect on her court was profound. Life at Windsor and Balmoral became subdued, crepuscular. Ministers grew frustrated with her withdrawal from public life. For the first 5 years after Albert's death, Victoria all but vanished from ceremonial life. Parliament complained, newspapers criticized, Republican sentiments flared, but she refused to yield. Her court became a place of whispers and footsteps. Light was dimmed, music was minimized. Conversation took place in lowered voices, as if Albert might overhear from the other side. And in this sepulchral silence, Victoria grew more rigid, more stubborn, more enthroned in her own private world. Albert, ironically, had been the one who most grounded her. As prince consort, he had no formal political power, but he wielded enormous influence over domestic reform, scientific advancement, and modernization efforts. He helped shape Victoria's sense of purpose. Without him, her reign risked drifting into stagnation. In his absence, she clung to symbols. And nowhere was this clearer than in the rooms. Historians, biographers, and royal staff have described the preservation of Albert's belongings with a mixture of awe and discomfort. It wasn't eccentricity, it wasn't even ritual, in the usual sense. It was almost clinical, the way a museum conservator handles artifacts. But the conservator, in this case, was the widow, and the artifact was the man she refused to release into the past. To maintain this illusion required collaboration. A network of servants had to participate in the staging, day after day, year after year, not as a performance, but as routine. There is something deeply uncanny about this, a monarchy that operated not through power, but through carefully rehearsed absence. Albert's bedroom at Frogmore, his books untouched, his photographs displayed exactly where he had placed them, became a kind of parallel monarchy, a quieter one, but no less sacred. Eventually, Victoria resumed her public duties, but she never stopped being the widow. Her identity and the British crown became fused with that grief. To be royal, in her era, was to be in mourning. Mourning was no longer an interlude between eras, it was the era. And the world adjusted. She met foreign leaders in black, opened parliament in black, reviewed troops in black. The color became so associated with her that it entered fashion as a statement of somber power. Mourning itself became a business funeral attire, etiquette manuals, memorial photography, all rose in prestige and popularity under Victoria's influence. Even as the empire expanded into Africa, India, the Pacific, Victoria remained rooted in personal loss. Her ministers came and went, new technologies emerged, the telephone arrived, electricity. But the rooms stayed the same. In time, these rooms would become historical footnotes, but in her lifetime, they were active psychological landscapes, evidence of a queen who transformed personal memory into political permanence. When she finally died in 1901, the end of an age was not just metaphorical. The black veil lifted, the empire shifted gears. The Edwardian era ushered in modernity. But the preserved rooms remained sealed in their own time, quiet monuments to the absurd intimacy of monarchy. Because here is the contradiction at the heart of royal life. Monarchs are public figures, but their power is often deeply private. It is shaped by longing, fear, loss, memory. By the rooms they don't leave, the rituals they don't abandon. Victoria's preservation of Albert's world was not irrational. It was monarchy at its most literal. She made her grief into governance. She ruled through absence, and the country eventually followed her lead. And if this story has a quiet sadness, the next one barrels into something more absurd because the next king didn't preserve anyone. He collected them. Or, more precisely, he collected a very specific kind of person, tall, silent, uniformed, and ideally over 6'3". 16. Frederick William I of Prussia, the giant soldier's obsession. Some monarchs want power, others want legacy. Frederick William I of Prussia? He wanted tall men, unnaturally tall men. Specifically, soldiers, elite grenadiers who stood head and shoulders above the rest of humanity, and preferably above each other. In a world where monarchs measured strength in land, titles, or fleets, Frederick measured it in inches. He was the soldier king, architect of Prussia's military identity, father to Frederick the Great and, quietly, the most height-obsessed ruler Europe ever produced. He didn't just admire tall men. He collected them, like antiques, like rare specimens, like chess pieces, for a game that existed mostly in his own mind. This peculiar obsession crystallized into the creation of the Potsdam Giants, a regiment officially named the Grand Grenadiers of Potsdam, but unofficially remembered as the Lang Curls Long. Guys, it wasn't just a nickname, it was the mission statement. The recruitment standards were absurd. 6'2" was the baseline. Anything under 6 feet? Don't bother. Anything over 6'5"? send them straight to the front of the parade. The average European male at the time stood somewhere between 5'5" and 5'7". Frederick was curating a regiment of human anomalies, and he wasn't above using bribes, diplomacy, or outright kidnapping to get them. Yes, kidnapping. Multiple accounts confirm that Prussian agents, with the king's knowledge and encouragement, scouted Europe's streets, fairs, and military outposts for tall men. If the candidate didn't want to join, arrangements could be made, offers could be sweetened or escalated. There are stories half confirmed, half legendary of tall peasants simply disappearing from border towns and reappearing months later in the elite Prussian regiment, drilled, dressed, and thoroughly bewildered. And when diplomacy was involved, foreign courts were encouraged to send tall recruits as gifts. Austria, Russia, the Netherlands all got the message. Want to impress the Prussian king? Don't send gold. Send your tallest guy. The more reluctant he is, the better the story. Frederick paid them well, very well. He wasn't building an army, per se, he was building an exhibit. The Potsdam giants weren't meant to fight. Not really. They were meant to be seen, paraded, marched in perfect formation, while foreign dignitaries watched, unnerved. He once declared, "The most beautiful girl or woman in the world would be a matter of indifference to me, but tall soldiers, they are my weakness." And weakness it was. He painted them, had portraits commissioned, memorized their names and ranks, visited them, praised them, micromanaged their uniforms, adjusted the height of their hats to exaggerate their stature even further. Some soldiers were given platform boots to qualify. Others were forced to stand on boxes during ceremonies. In one account, a particularly tall recruit died and was embalmed, allegedly preserved by the king, to inspire the others. This was not just a military quirk. It was a window into Frederick's entire worldview. He saw the world in terms of order, strength, discipline, and spectacle. His entire reign was devoted to turning Prussia from a loose collection of territories into a tightly run military state. He slashed court expenses, reduced the nobility's privileges, restructured the tax system, and enforced rigid bureaucratic standards. He was ruthless, austere, and tireless. The army was everything. And in the middle of it all stood his glittering obsession, the giants. What makes it so surreal is that these men were, for the most part, ornamental. They trained, certainly, they drilled, but they rarely fought. Their primary function was ceremonial standing guard, appearing in military reviews, marching at carefully timed intervals to impress or intimidate. Frederick didn't want to risk them in actual combat. That would defeat the point. And the point was psychological. Because for all his personal discipline and administrative brilliance, Frederick was also deeply anxious. He feared disorder, feared weakness, feared humiliation. He inherited a kingdom that was small, fragmented, and constantly under threat from its larger neighbors. His obsession with tall soldiers was a projection, a living metaphor for the height he wanted Prussia to achieve. If your country isn't naturally powerful, you simulate it. Build an army of giants. March them through your capital. Show the world that even if your territory is small, your soldiers are not. And it worked sort of. Foreign diplomats were, in fact, unnerved. Visitors to Potsdam returned home with breathless descriptions of these towering troops, precision-marched into myth. The giants became part of Prussia's brand militarism, mixed with eccentricity, and while they didn't fight often, their symbolic value was immense. They embodied the idea of Prussia as a nation disciplined down to the individual inch. But obsession is a poor strategist. Frederick's fixation cost money, time, focus. While the broader army improved under his rule, thanks to his reforms, it was his son, Frederick the Great, who would actually wield that army with brilliance. The father built the machine. The son turned it into empire. And the giants? The son disbanded them. Frederick William died in 1740. His son, upon taking the throne, immediately scaled back the regiment. He found the whole thing vaguely embarrassing. As a military commander, he needed troops who could fight, not just impress. The giants were too big, too expensive, and too symbolically tied to a father he had struggled against for years. Because while the regiment may have been tall, The relationship between father and son was famously brittle. Frederick the Great was everything his father distrusted: artistic, philosophical, emotional. He played the flute. He read French literature. He once tried to flee the court with a friend. His father had the friend executed and forced the boy to watch. It was one of the most traumatic events of the young prince's life, and it left a scar that no number of grenadiers could hide. So when the son finally got the throne, he didn't just reform the army. He reformed memory. The giants were quietly retired. Their legacy preserved in paintings and military museums, but their parade ground silent. Still, the image lingers. A king who measured greatness by inches, who thought height could stand in for stability, who built a personal army not to win wars, but to defeat his own sense of inadequacy. Frederick William I remains one of history's strangest architects of militarism, a man who turned a physical trait into national symbolism, who blurred the line between discipline and delusion, who ruled through regiments and found comfort in tall shadows. And if he saw height as the ultimate display of royal power, the next monarch we meet thought power meant something else entirely: the ability to bend time itself, not metaphorically, literally, with clocks. All of them, half an hour wrong, just so he could enjoy a longer afternoon of shooting. 17. Edward VII, Sandringham time, the private time zone for royal hunting. In the annals of royal eccentricity, there are kings who believe they're made of glass, queens who preserve rooms like shrines, and emperors who drink mercury chasing immortality. And then there's Edward VII, a monarch so particular, so committed to his own pleasures, that he didn't just control people, places, or policy. He controlled time itself. Not metaphorically, not poetically, literally, as in clocks, dozens of them, set to the wrong time on purpose across an entire royal estate. This was Sandringham time, the private time zone created by Edward VII so that he could extend his winter daylight hours for hunting, 30 minutes ahead of Greenwich Mean Time. No global crisis, no geopolitical strategy, no scientific breakthrough, just a very rich man moving the entire rhythm of life forward half an hour so he could shoot more pheasants. Welcome to monarchy. To understand this story, you have to understand Edward. Before he was king, he was the Prince of Wales for an excruciatingly long time. His mother, Queen Victoria, reigned from 1837 to 1901, over 6 decades of imperial power and moral rigidity. Edward, by contrast, was flamboyant, social, and frequently in trouble. His early life was marked by tension with Victoria, who famously blamed him for his father's death, scolded him for his lifestyle, and considered him unfit to rule, which meant Edward spent most of his adult life in a sort of royal limbo, highly visible, yet fundamentally sidelined. And so, he created his own kingdom. One of fashion, dinner parties, diplomacy, and most of all, leisure. Enter Sandringham House, the Norfolk estate purchased by the royal family in 1862 as a home for Edward and his new bride, Alexandra. Over time, it became more than just a residence. It was his haven, his retreat, his private kingdom, where he could host his friends, command his schedule, and indulge in his greatest pleasure, hunting. Edward was, above all else, a creature of ritual. He didn't just enjoy hunting, he depended on it. It was physical, social, and deeply symbolic, a way to demonstrate skill, masculinity, and aristocratic tradition, all wrapped up in fresh air and tweed. But winter days are short, especially in England. Light fades quickly, targets disappear into the dusk. And Edward, who disliked being rushed in the morning, faced a problem. The solution? Move the clocks forward. Not for the country, just for Sandringham. Starting in the 1890s, all the clocks on the estate, from grand mantelpieces to humble servant watches, were reset to run 30 minutes ahead of Greenwich Mean Time. This wasn't a daylight saving policy. This was daylight hoarding. Edward wanted more time to hunt, so he made it. If the sun wouldn't cooperate, the clocks would. The servants called it Sandringham time. They hated it. It threw off deliveries, confused guests, ruined train connections. Imagine living in a house where everything is technically wrong but also enforced with royal decree. Miss dinner by half an hour? You're late. Show up on actual time? You're also late. The king's time was the only time that mattered. And Edward was serious about it. His schedule at Sandringham was famously precise. Breakfast at 9 a.m. Sandringham time, 8:30 GMT. Guns loaded by 10. Lunch at 1:30, tea at 5. He would shoot all day, return covered in mud and satisfaction, and then change into full formal attire for dinner, every night, no exceptions. Tailcoat, decorations, starched shirt, because monarchy is performance, even when you've spent the day chasing partridges through a foggy meadow. The effect of Sandringham time was subtle but powerful. It created a bubble, a little world running slightly ahead of reality, perfectly synchronized with one man's preferences. Visitors, ministers, and foreign dignitaries were forced to adjust. Some found it charming, others maddening. But it was also a reminder of something deeper. The king's time is not your time. Edward eventually ascended the throne in 1901, and Sandringham time came with him, for a while. Even after his death in 1910, the tradition lingered. His son, George V, continued it out of habit and reverence, despite hating it. Official clocks on the estate remained 30 minutes fast until 1936, a full generation of royal staff, forced to live in temporal exile, caught between history and punctuality. There's a quiet tyranny in this kind of eccentricity. It seems whimsical, a royal quirk, but underneath, it's pure control. Edward didn't move the clocks because he misunderstood time. He moved them because he understood power. In a world that bowed to his whims, he simply extended those whims to the very measurement of daily life. And unlike some royal peculiarities, this one left no real harm, just confusion, annoyance, the occasional missed train. But it also revealed something telling about Edward's worldview, a belief that the monarch's desires should shape the world around him, literally bend time and space to fit the day's agenda. And if that idea feels absurd, it should. But also, it's monarchy. A system built not on efficiency, but on ritual, not on logic, but on tradition, not on clocks, but on symbols. And yet, Sandringham time still lingers in British royal lore. It's a footnote in most histories, but a strange one, a reminder that even something as supposedly objective as time becomes flexible under absolute privilege. It's not the most grotesque royal decision, not the most famous, but it's among the most honest. Edward VII didn't care about metaphysics. He didn't need to believe he was made of glass, or drink mercury, or commune with the dead. He just wanted to shoot birds, and for that, the world would run 30 minutes ahead. Because he said so. And if that reminds you of early media manipulation or image crafting, wait until you meet the woman who mastered it, a ruler who staged her own image with the precision of a film director, combining imperial mystique with photographic control, a queen who turned portraiture into politics. 18. Empress Dowager, Cixi Royal, image-making through staged portrait worlds. It's one thing to rule from behind a curtain. It's another to choreograph every thread of that curtain, every beam of light that strikes it, and every angle from which others might glimpse your silhouette through it. This is the level at which Empress Dowager Cixi operated not just politically, but visually, symbolically, and obsessively. While European monarchs were still commissioning stiff oil paintings that made them look like solemn furniture, Cixi was experimenting with photography as statecraft, a queen mother turned political director, costumer, and stage manager of her own imperial myth. And she had to be. Because Cixi ruled not from the throne, but through a series of shadows, first as a concubine, then as regent, and ultimately as the central figure in one of the most unstable periods in Qing dynasty history. She never claimed power openly. She orchestrated it. She never signed herself empress in title. She made herself empress in fact. And what's more astonishing, she understood that in an age of cameras, power is what you look like holding it. Born in 1835 to a relatively modest Manchu family, Cixi entered the Forbidden City as a low-ranking concubine and rose with uncanny speed. When the Xianfeng Emperor died in 1861, she seized control of the regency on behalf of her infant son, orchestrating a palace coup with precision that made European court intrigue look like amateur hour. From then until her death in 1908, she ruled China either outright or from behind the curtain, quite literally. At public audiences, male ministers would address the throne, while Cixi listened and issued commands from behind a silk screen, symbolically hidden, yet unmistakably dominant. But it wasn't enough to hold power. Cixi knew that in a world increasingly defined by Western incursions, modernization, and media, how she appeared mattered almost as much as what she did. So, she crafted herself, carefully, artistically, relentlessly. In the 1900s, she began sitting for staged photographic portraits, an unusual act for Chinese royalty, where photography was still treated with a mixture of curiosity and superstition. But Cixi wasn't trying to be traditional. She was trying to control the narrative. These photos weren't candid. They weren't artful captures of imperial spontaneity. They were elaborately staged visual events, costumes chosen to communicate power, poses dictated by court etiquette, and personal drama. The most famous of these portraits, taken by court photographers like Yu Xunling, are rich with symbolic cues: peacock feathers, dragon motifs, embroidered robes, ornate hairpieces, and backdrops designed to blur the line between throne room and theater set. Look closer, and you realize, this isn't documentation, it's performance. Cixi didn't just use the camera, she directed it. She chose lighting, costumes, props. She sometimes changed outfits mid-session. She dictated hand positions holding a fan, displaying a ring, resting on a specific piece of jade furniture. The court photographers acted more like stage managers than artists, arranging silks, directing the angles, clearing reflections from glass, aligning carpets to perfection. The result was a series of images that now look iconic, imperial, serene, unapproachable, but in their own time, they were unprecedented acts of political branding. Cixi understood what few monarchs did. Photography wasn't just a way to record power. It was a way to produce it. Remember, this was a woman ruling an empire in visible decline. The Qing dynasty was being pulled apart by internal rebellion, foreign interference, and accelerating modernization. She was often blamed, rightly or wrongly, for resisting reform, hoarding power, or clinging to outdated systems. Western newspapers caricatured her as cruel, reclusive, anti-modern. Chinese reformers portrayed her as a reactionary obstacle. And so, she countered not with speeches, not with proclamations, but with portraits. Images of calm, poise, supremacy. Not smiling, not emoting, embodying. She used the visual language of power to stabilize her legacy, even as the institutions beneath her feet trembled. At the same time, these images served another function. They blurred the line between imperial tradition and modern technology. They showed a monarch still rooted in ancient symbols, dragons, court dress, Confucian gestures, but willing to use the latest tools of modernity to preserve them. A paradox embodied. A ruler projecting timelessness via a time-stamped medium. This contradiction is what made her imagery so powerful. She wasn't resisting the future, she was reframing it to look like the past, or vice versa. And this strategy was not without cost. Critics accused her of vanity. Some argued she was hiding political failures behind embroidery and photo shoots. Others viewed her photographic sessions as a kind of decadent denial, picture-perfect images in the face of national crisis. But in many ways, that was the point. Cixi understood that royal image wasn't about authenticity, it was about myth maintenance. Just like Louis XIV used surgery to prove his divine resilience, or Queen Victoria turned grief into public ritual, Cixi turned herself into an imperial symbol so carefully curated that no minister, diplomat, or foreign critic could easily puncture it. And she wasn't just performing for foreign powers. These images were also circulated within China, shown to officials, sent to allies, hung in temples. They became tools of state, like seals or decrees. Except instead of text, they told a visual story. Your ruler is still here, still serene, still supreme. And the kicker? Most of the public never saw her in person. That was by design. The Empress was an idea, a silhouette behind a curtain, a face behind a fan, a portrait frozen in imperial time. Her power was constructed as much in absence as in presence. Even today, those images feel eerie. Not because of what they reveal, but because of what they refuse to. There's no vulnerability, no spontaneity, no aging. just pose, robe, throne, the perfection of imperial distance. When Cixi died in 1908, she left behind an empire teetering on collapse. The Qing dynasty would fall just 4 years later. But her image lingered, a final echo of a dying world, made briefly immortal through controlled light and shutter clicks. What she created wasn't just propaganda. It was prophecy, a ruler aware that the future would judge her through images and determined to control every pixel of memory. Because monarchy is never just rule. It's ritual, costume, light. And if Cixi curated herself into stillness, the next emperor we meet went in the opposite direction, embracing life in motion, not as a ruler, but as a scientist, not in robes, but in a lab coat. A man born divine by tradition, who spent his days studying starfish. 19. Hirohito, Emperor Showa of Japan, the monarch as marine biologist. To the average onlooker, a man peering into a tank of sea creatures might look like a hobbyist, maybe a professor, maybe a collector. But this man, the one bent over with quiet focus, magnifying glass in hand, gently cataloging a new species of hydrozoan, was not just a scientist. He was the Emperor of Japan. Hirohito, known posthumously as Emperor Showa, ruled one of the most tumultuous eras in modern history, from the rise of militarist Japan through World War II, atomic devastation, surrender, and into the economic boom that redefined a nation. But while most headlines attached to his name involve war, diplomacy, and imperial policy, Hirohito himself was far more interested in things that couldn't speak, couldn't vote, and certainly couldn't wage war. He was, before all else and after all else, a marine biologist. And not in the sense that he liked to fish. Hirohito didn't merely collect shells or admire aquariums. He published, he classified, he described new species. His work was cited internationally. His research was meticulous, quiet, focused, unthreatening, which made it all the more surreal and perhaps all the more revealing. Because Hirohito represents one of the strangest dualities in modern monarchy. A man worshipped as divine by tradition, surrounded by generals and nation-builders, quietly devoting his personal hours to sea slugs. To understand the disconnect, you have to understand the structure of the Japanese imperial institution in the early 20th century. At birth, Hirohito was not simply born into royalty. He was born into a framework where emperors were treated as divine descendants of the sun goddess Amaterasu. It was not a political title, it was cosmic. And yet, Hirohito's own life paints a strange contrast. Instead of thunderous pronouncements from the heavens, we find notebooks full of jellyfish taxonomy. He first showed a deep interest in marine biology as a young man. Unlike many monarchs whose education is ornamental at best, Hirohito's was extensive and exacting. He read Western scientific texts, kept notebooks, corresponded with biologists. He was especially drawn to the delicate and complex world of marine invertebrates, animals with strange geometries and fluid motions, so unlike the rigid hierarchies surrounding him. In 1925, before even becoming emperor, Hirohito published a scientific paper on hydrozoans, small, predatory animals related to jellyfish and corals. He would go on to publish several more studies, many under his personal name and others with the assistance of imperial biological staff. He even co-authored entries in scientific journals, describing new species found in Japanese waters. What's striking isn't that he wrote these papers, it's that he wrote them himself. He didn't outsource the research. He didn't ghostwrite. These weren't vanity projects. By all professional accounts, Hirohito was a serious amateur scientist, more dedicated and precise than most full-time researchers. One Smithsonian Institution archive photograph captures him at work. A formal room, transformed into a temporary lab. Bowls of sea creatures in front of him. His gaze intense, thoughtful. Not the pose of a figurehead, not even the pose of a ruler, the pose of a curious mind. But of course, he was a ruler, and not just any ruler. Hirohito became emperor in 1926, just as Japan entered a period of political radicalization, economic strain, and ultranationalist fervor. Military leaders grew in power. The country pushed into Manchuria. War with China escalated. Then came Pearl Harbor, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. the firebombing of Tokyo. The Pacific War left millions dead. And all the while, Hirohito remained the symbolic center of the nation. The debate over how much political or military control he actually exercised during this time is still deeply contested. Some argue he was manipulated by militarists. Others say he condoned the campaigns. Still others insist he operated within carefully managed constraints. But what no one disputes is this. While Japan descended into some of the bloodiest conflict in its history, its emperor was also personally studying the mating habits of sea cucumbers. What do you do with a contradiction like that? On the one hand, Hirohito used his status and resources to build a private scientific laboratory, complete with seawater tanks, specimen drawers, and microscopes. He had full-time marine biologists on staff. He sponsored research. He helped advance marine taxonomy in Japan. On the other hand, his name, his image was used to inspire soldiers, colonize neighbors, and symbolize divine authority. His public persona was godlike. His private self? Quiet, curious, precise, clinical. After Japan's defeat in 1945, this contradiction only deepened. During negotiations with the Allied powers, particularly the United States, the question of what to do with the emperor became central. Should he be tried, dethroned, retained as a stabilizing symbol? Ultimately, Hirohito remained, but under strict terms. In 1946, he formally renounced his divine status in the Humanity Declaration, a speech ghostwritten under American oversight. Overnight, the living god became a constitutional monarch, a symbol without sovereign power, a relic made useful. And what did Hirohito do with his now empty afternoons? He went back to the sea. In the post-war years, he expanded his marine studies, continued his taxonomies, collaborated with international researchers. His collected papers were later published in volumes not as royal propaganda, but as genuine contributions to biology. It was as if, released from the burden of myth, Hirohito could finally live the life he had wanted all along, not as emperor, but as observer. Watching the world, recording its strangeness, classifying its mysteries. And perhaps there is something telling in that. Monarchy is, at its core, a performance, a series of symbolic acts meant to convey certainty. But Hirohito's fascination was with uncertainty, with creatures so fragile, so translucent, so overlooked, that studying them feels like an act of devotion. He wasn't the only royal to turn inward, but he might have been the only one who turned microscopic trading diplomatic summits for lab dishes, speeches for field guides. And this shift wasn't just personal, it was strategic. In post-war Japan, Hirohito's quiet presence, paired with his evident harmlessness, helped stabilize a national identity in flux. He had once been a war god. Now, he was a grandfatherly biologist. The transformation was seamless, almost suspiciously so, but it worked. The image of him hunched over sea specimens circulated far and wide. It told a very specific story. This is not a man of war. This is a man of science. Harmless, diligent, focused. The message was clear. Let the past be. Let the emperor be. And yet the sea creatures remained. Decades after the war, Hirohito continued to publish. His marine work was meticulous, obscure, and absolutely consistent. In a world where his reputation was complicated, his research remained the one place where he could control the variables. The emperor as scientist, the god as cataloger, the symbol as observer. And maybe that's the true mystery of Hirohito, not what he did during war, but what he chose to spend his freedom on. Not parades, not memoirs, not public appearances, but jellyfish. Because when you strip away the crown, the mythology, the political symbolism, what remains is the smallest thing of all, what you pay attention to when no one is watching. And while Hirohito gazed into petri dishes, the next king we meet gazed into a woman, a dancer, a scandal, a political firestorm named Lola Montez. And from that gaze, an entire throne began to crumble. 20. King Ludwig I of Bavaria, Lola Montez, and the scandal that helped topple a throne. Most kings fall for ideas, empire, dynasty, order. Very few fall for someone like Lola Montez, a woman who once passed herself off as a Spanish dancer, whipped a riding crop at journalists, and could, by sheer force of chaos and charm, throw an entire monarchy off balance. But King Ludwig I of Bavaria wasn't just any king. He was a romantic, a collector of beauty, a patron of art and sensuality, and ultimately, a man so smitten by his own curated version of reality that when Lola stormed into it, she fit perfectly. Until she didn't. This isn't a story about war, or reform, or conquest. It's about personal obsession turning into public collapse, the moment when royal fantasy met revolutionary fire, and no one could tell the difference between scandal and regime change. Ludwig I ruled Bavaria from 1825 to 1848, and from the start, he made it clear that he was not interested in being boring. Aesthetically minded, deeply religious, and prone to grand gestures, Ludwig fancied himself a kind of philosopher king. He styled Munich into an Athens of the North, funded art museums, collected sculptures, and surrounded himself with muses, literal muses, commissioning their portraits for his gallery of beauties. It was monarchy as moodboard. Then came Lola. She arrived in Munich in 1846, claiming to be a Spanish aristocrat and internationally acclaimed dancer. In truth, she was born Eliza Gilbert in Ireland and had spent most of her adult life reinventing herself across European stages, salons, and scandal sheets. She wasn't the best dancer, but that didn't matter. Her appeal wasn't about skill, it was about defiance. She didn't behave, and in a court full of stiff formalities and powdered hypocrisies, that was catnip. Ludwig saw her perform once, and was hooked. Within weeks, he was writing poetry about her. Within months, he had gifted her a title, Baroness of Rosenthal. She became a court fixture, bypassing traditional etiquette, and wielded influence far beyond her formal status. Ministers were dismissed if she didn't like them. Newspapers faced censorship for mocking her. Critics who questioned her behavior faced retaliation. In a monarchy, proximity to the king is power, and Lola had proximity on tap. This didn't go over well. Bavarian society, already jittery from economic unrest and revolutionary whispers spreading across Europe, now had to contend with a foreign woman who openly sneered at protocol, carried herself like royalty, and apparently had the king under a spell. She had enemies in every corner of court life, conservatives who viewed her as immoral, liberals who saw her as a distraction, and royalists who were just deeply uncomfortable watching the monarchy bleed credibility. Meanwhile, Ludwig, a man who once tried to resign over parliamentary defiance, now doubled down. He defended her publicly. He threatened resignations. He tried to reshape public opinion by sheer force of decree. It was as if he thought he could will Bavaria into accepting her, the same way he once willed Munich into becoming an art capital. But political legitimacy is not a painting. It cannot be curated by taste alone. By 1848, things exploded. Revolution swept Europe that year: Paris, Berlin, Vienna. The old monarchies faced uprisings, demands for constitutional reform, and calls for liberalization. In Bavaria, the unrest was sharpened by anger at the Lola affair. Students protested. Riots broke out. Anti-Lola graffiti appeared on public walls. Petitions demanded her expulsion and the king's abdication. And Ludwig, ever the aesthete, never the tactician, blinked. He dismissed Lola. She fled Bavaria under threat of violence, first to Switzerland, then further abroad. But it was too late. The scandal had metastasized. The king's credibility was in tatters. His ministers deserted him. Protesters filled the streets. Ludwig tried to weather the storm, but monarchy is a performance, and once you're booed off stage, the curtain doesn't rise again. He abdicated on the 20th of March, 1848. To Ludwig, this was not just a political loss, it was a betrayal of beauty. He had always imagined himself as a protector of culture, a patron of inspiration. Lola, to him, wasn't just a dancer. She was a living muse, an embodiment of fiery freedom in a stifling world. But to everyone else, she was a catalyst, the spark that made Bavaria's monarchy look ridiculous enough to overthrow. And that's the deeper twist. This wasn't about Lola. Not really. She didn't cause the revolution. She merely personified everything that was already cracking: the economy, the censorship, The inflexibility of the regime, she just gave it all a face. A face the people could laugh at, or rage against. A woman as symbol, as scapegoat, as lightning rod. And Ludwig? He handed her the lightning. After abdication, Ludwig didn't disappear entirely. He continued to fund the arts and dabble in politics behind the scenes, but he never recovered his reputation. He became a cautionary tale, the king who fell in love and lost his crown, a royal who mistook private infatuation for public policy. As for Lola, she kept moving, through Europe, across America, even into Australia. She lectured, she performed, she fought duels, she wrote a memoir. She was, to the end, untamable. And perhaps that was her real gift. Not beauty, not talent, but the ability to bend powerful men around her, then vanish before the fallout hit. And there's something almost operatic about it, the way Ludwig's love for Lola revealed the fragility of monarchy itself. A system that insists on mystique, decorum, and symbolic purity cannot afford personal chaos. Especially when that chaos dances barefoot through palace corridors and whispers policy suggestions between kisses. Because when the royal veil slips, when people see the human behind the throne, they don't always lean in with sympathy. Sometimes they lunge with knives, or petitions, or pamphlets. Ludwig's downfall didn't come from treason, or war, or assassination. It came from being seen too clearly, loving too visibly, failing to distinguish between the king's heart and the crown's responsibilities. And in that way, he shares something unexpected with our next monarch, a French king whose favorites weren't dancers, but elegant young men. A king who fought wars not just on battlefields, but in salons, court fashion, and pamphlet warfare. A king whose reputation unraveled not because of crime or policy, but because of style. 21. Henri III of France, mignons, fashion politics, and reputation warfare. In most monarchies, power wears armor, or robes, or at least something vaguely intimidating. But Henri III of France, the last ruling Valois king, dared to wield power in silk stockings, scented gloves, and earrings that shimmered like whispered rumors. His court was not a battlefield. It was a runway, a stage, a war of aesthetics. And his greatest weapons weren't generals, but the mignons, his inner circle of exquisitely dressed, carefully coiffed, and deeply polarizing male favorites. They were loyal, they were beautiful, and they nearly got him killed politically and, ultimately, literally. Henri III ruled during one of the most volatile and blood-soaked chapters of French history, the Wars of Religion. Catholics and Huguenots were tearing the kingdom apart. Paris was perpetually on the verge of revolt. The monarchy was weak, bankrupt, and gasping for relevance. But what did Henri do in response to all this chaos? He threw lavish balls, designed intricate court rituals, wrote devotional poetry, reinvented himself as a kind of Catholic mystic aesthete hybrid, retreating into personal piety while surrounded by men so stylish that even the nobles didn't know whether to bow, sneer, or panic. The word mignon in French means darling, cute, or beloved. At Henri's court, it referred to the cluster of young noblemen who followed him everywhere, dressed in matching fashions, spoke in courtly riddles, and functioned as a kind of royal clique/political shield. They were not official ministers. They were not commanders. They were, in many cases, second sons of aristocratic families with more ambition than inheritance. But under Henri, they were elevated, endlessly, publicly. They wore perfumes, makeup, and elaborate lace. Their hair was curled, their gestures choreographed. They were seen constantly in Henri's company at prayers, during court ceremonies, even at military councils. They dined with him. They walked arm in arm with him. And they defended his reputation with swords and whispers. What resulted wasn't just gossip. It was outright propaganda warfare. Pamphlets circulated across Paris depicting Henri as effeminate, unmanly, and morally unfit to rule. He was mocked for dressing like a woman, for praying like a monk, for preferring the company of mignons to that of traditional courtiers. One notorious tract called him a hermaphrodite king, unfit to lead warriors, more suited to preside over a salon. But these weren't just cheap insults. They were political weapons. In 16th century France, masculinity was closely tied to political legitimacy. Kings were expected to be warrior figures, stern fathers to the nation. Henri's embrace of flamboyant aesthetics, emotional display, and intimate male company challenged that entire image. And for his enemies, especially the ultra-Catholic House of Guise, who wanted the throne for themselves, this was the soft underbelly of his reign. If they couldn't defeat him with armies, they'd destroy him through reputation rot. And it worked. Over time, the Mignons became symbols not just of Henri's taste, but of royal corruption. They were accused of manipulating policy, steering court appointments, and squandering funds. Some were linked to duels, others to scandals. Whether true or exaggerated, the perception stuck that France was being ruled not by a king, but by a perfumed cabal of overgrown adolescents in ruffles. In 1578, things boiled over. A brutal duel erupted between Henri's Mignons and rival courtiers from more traditional noble factions. It was one of the most sensational duels in French history, not just for the blood spilled, 5 nobles died, but for the symbolism. This was not personal. This was political theater with swords. The fight was widely interpreted as a proxy war for the soul of the monarchy. Henri wept over the dead Mignons, had their portraits painted, ordered lavish funerals. The people of Paris rolled their eyes. To many, it was further proof that the king had abandoned his duty. While France burned with civil war, he was mourning stylish young courtiers, like fallen saints. While the nation craved stability, Henri offered stylized grief and public displays of emotion that, to his critics, felt deeply unkingly. And yet Henri wasn't an empty-headed aesthete. He was, in many ways, an intelligent and devout man. He fasted, he read theology, he tried to negotiate peace between the religious factions. But it was his style, not his substance, that defined him. Because monarchy is theater, and Henri was staging the wrong play. He was performing a vision of kingship that simply no longer fit the age. In a world of muskets and dogma and rebellion, he was offering incense and lace and private mysticism. The stage lights were on, but the audience had turned hostile. By the late 1580s, Henri's position was precarious. He had no legitimate heirs. His only plausible successor was the Protestant Henry of Navarre, the future Henri IV, which enraged the Catholic League. In 1588, after escalating tensions, Henri ordered the assassination of the Duke of Guise, a shocking act that briefly stunned his enemies but turned the public even more against him. He fled Paris. And in 1589, he was assassinated by a Catholic zealot disguised as a monk. The Mignons were gone. The Valois line ended with his death. France passed to the Bourbons. But the legacy of Henri III remains complex. In some modern circles, he's seen as a tragic figure, a sensitive, artistic soul, trapped in a world of brutality. Others see him as a monarch who failed to adapt, who let personal taste and image sabotage his own power base. Either way, he left behind something rare, a court remembered not for its policies, but for its fashion statements, its aesthetic wars, and its flamboyant performances of loyalty and masculinity. And in that, he foreshadowed a much later kind of royalty, the kind that exists in front of cameras, where styling matters more than speeches, and where myth is managed not with armies, but with optics. Henri's reign wasn't undone by a single mistake. It was undone by accumulated perception. Every feathered hat, every velvet robe, every whispered rumor about his favorites added up to a narrative that no decree could erase. Because in monarchy, once the public stops believing the king is a king, he isn't. And that belief, that fragile performance of royal authority, is exactly what our next figure tried to rescue. A ruler who didn't just collect art or people, but the entire universe, piece by piece, building a kingdom of objects to make sense of a world that refused to explain itself. His name? Rudolph II. And he didn't just want to rule the Holy Roman Empire. He wanted to curate reality itself. 22. Rudolph II. Again. Because the collection wasn't just art, it was a worldview. It's easy to reduce him to a collector. To file Rudolph II, Holy Roman Emperor, under the usual labels, eccentric, reclusive, odd. a man who preferred star charts to battlefields, alchemical texts to treaties, and glass cabinets full of mysteries to meetings with ministers. But that would miss the point. Rudolf II didn't just collect objects. He curated a worldview obsessively, intentionally, and sometimes desperately. He tried to create a system that could hold everything: art, magic, science, faith, dreams, and nightmares. It wasn't a collection. It was a cosmos. Rewind to the late 16th century. Europe was a powder keg of religious war, imperial ambition, and scientific upheaval. The Protestant Reformation had fractured Catholic dominance. The Catholic Counter-Reformation was in full swing. Monarchs were drawing lines in blood and theology. And in the middle of it all sat Rudolf II, the Habsburg heir, who didn't seem to want to be a king in the traditional sense. He inherited the throne of the Holy Roman Empire in 1576. Instead of ruling from Vienna, he moved his court to Prague, which would become the stage for one of the most unusual cultural and intellectual experiments in European history. At a glance, it looked like a Renaissance dream. Astronomers, mathematicians, painters, metallurgists, mystics, all orbiting the emperor like moons around a sun that rarely left the palace. Among his courtiers, Tycho Brahe, the Danish astronomer with his artificial nose and giant sky instruments, Johannes Kepler, whose work on planetary motion would reshape physics, Giuseppe Arcimboldo, who painted surreal portraits made of vegetables, animals, and books. But this wasn't just Rudolf collecting the best minds of Europe like Pokemon cards. He was building a total knowledge engine, a court that, in theory, could map everything. Everything. Not just the planets and their orbits, not just the human body, but the invisible correspondences between things. The relationships between metals and planets, herbs and humors, colors and spirits. He funded alchemical research not to create gold, necessarily, but to understand the hidden architecture of reality. To Rudolf, the boundaries between disciplines weren't barriers, they were invitations. Astrology bled into medicine, alchemy bled into chemistry, theology flirted with natural philosophy. Even art became a form of metaphysical inquiry, a way to capture truths too subtle for words. And at the center of it all was his cabinet of curiosities, the legendary Kunstkammer. This was no simple trophy room. The Kunstkammer was a microcosm, a collection of natural specimens, rare objects, scientific instruments, mechanical marvels, religious relics, mythological artifacts, and unclassifiable oddities. Everything from unicorn horns, probably narwhal tusks, to automata that moved on their own, from celestial globes to bones of so-called giants. It was a museum, a laboratory, a shrine, and a puzzle all at once. To walk through it was to see the world rearranged by obsession. Each object was placed with care, labeled not just with its origin but its associations. This mineral linked to this planet, which governed this metal, which corresponded to this part of the body, which was ruled by this sign. It wasn't chaos. It was Rudolf's order. And that's what makes it so unsettling. Because the more you examine this collection, this universe in miniature, the more you sense a kind of spiritual panic beneath it. A monarch desperately trying to impose pattern on a world that refused to behave. While other emperors deployed armies, Rudolf deployed meaning. And when meaning failed, he gathered more objects. He didn't lead battles. He didn't tour his territories. He barely left the palace. His ministers complained. His enemies plotted. The empire teetered. But Rudolf stayed in his chambers, surrounded by charts and creatures and impossible machines, convinced that if he just found the right configuration, the world would finally make sense. In a way, it was alchemy by empire, taking chaos, pressure, and time, and hoping it would transmute into order. Gold not as metal, but as epiphany. But here's the thing. No amount of collecting could stabilize reality. And as the outside world grew more dangerous, Rudolf's internal world grew more elaborate. He commissioned mechanical devices that mimicked celestial movements. He funded the construction of ever more precise astronomical instruments. He pored over horoscopes to decide who to trust. He withdrew further into the labyrinth of his court. And that court glittering, brilliant, bizarre, began to collapse under the weight of its own symbolism. By the early 1600s, his erratic behavior and political inaction had made him a liability. The Habsburg family, never one to tolerate artistic brooding for too long, intervened. His brother Matthias maneuvered against him. In 1608, Rudolf was forced to cede the crown of Hungary. In 1611, he lost Bohemia. Days later, he died surrounded not by family, but by his collection. The universe he built did not save him, but it remains one of the most remarkable intellectual ecosystems ever created. And what lingers isn't the politics, it's the vision. Rudolf's Prague was a place where a comet could cause both scientific debate and existential dread, where a mechanical lion was as meaningful as a gospel, where collecting the world wasn't about owning it, but decoding it. That's the part modern historians and curators still grapple with. The Kunstkammer wasn't just a hoard. It was a theory one that said, everything in the universe is connected, and if you look closely enough, the truth will reveal itself. It's an idea that feels naive now. We know better, don't we? But maybe we don't. Maybe we're still doing what Rudolf did, obsessing over data, building museums, categorizing, theorizing, connecting dots. The only difference is, we call it science, not alchemy. Psychology, not astrology. Technology, not magic. And somewhere, Rudolf might be smirking behind a celestial globe. Because even if his empire faltered, his aesthetic of curiosity lives on. In every museum, every lab, every strange drawer of oddities labeled with taxonomies we don't fully understand. The idea that knowledge is a map, and we're still sketching the corners. And if Rudolf tried to rule the universe by collecting it, our next emperor took a different approach. He didn't try to catalog reality. He tried to immortalize it, not with science, but with mercury, tombs, and an afterlife engineered like a machine. A man who believed he could cheat death by building a kingdom underground. His name? Qin Shi Huang. And he wasn't planning for legacy. He was planning forever. 23. Qin Shi Huang again, because even Britannica keeps repeating the Mercury rumor. There are some rumors that refuse to die, not because they're confirmed or even particularly plausible, but because they feel right. They touch something primal in the collective imagination. They linger like a whispered riddle, and few historical figures are surrounded by such stubborn mystery as Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China. He unified China. He built vast roads, walls, bureaucracies. He reshaped a fragmented land into a centralized empire, redefined currency, weights, laws. He did what no one before him had done, forced coherence from chaos. But it's what he did underground that still haunts us. Every encyclopedia entry, no matter how rational or evidence-based, eventually circles back to the same phrase, rivers of mercury. An emperor's tomb, unexcavated, sits under a massive hill in Shaanxi province, rumored for centuries to contain a subterranean replica of the known world, complete with flowing streams of liquid metal. It sounds impossible. It sounds absurd. It also sounds exactly like something he would do. Let's start with what we know. In 1974, farmers digging a well near the city of Xi'an uncovered one of the most astonishing archaeological finds in modern history, the Terracotta Army. Thousands of life-size soldiers, horses, chariots, each uniquely sculpted, positioned for battle, buried in formation, and this was just the beginning. The Terracotta Army wasn't a freestanding monument. It was merely the outer defense of something much larger, the mausoleum of Qin Shi Huang, who died in 210 BCE. The tomb itself remains largely untouched, out of both respect and fear. Respect for its historical importance. Fear of damaging what may be an extremely fragile and toxic interior system. And then, there are the texts. The main source of the Mercury story is a Han Dynasty historian named Sima Qian, writing a century after Qin's death. In his Records of the Grand Historian, he described the tomb as an underground palace, so vast and so detailed that it replicated rivers, mountains, and even the ocean, with mercury used to simulate flowing water, kept in motion by clever mechanical devices. According to Sima Qian, the ceiling of the tomb was painted with constellations, crossbows were installed as traps to prevent looters. And the emperor, famously obsessed with immortality, had gone to his grave surrounded not just by statues but by a world rebuilt in miniature, a world made eternal. Now, historians are trained skeptics. They will tell you, and they have that ancient sources often exaggerate, that court historians are prone to dramatize, that a river of mercury is symbolic, allegorical, metaphorical. And yet, modern soil tests in the area have revealed unusually high concentrations of mercury. Not proof, not excavation, but a whisper from the dirt, the kind that makes archaeologists pause. Why mercury? That's the real question. Mercury wasn't just an exotic material in ancient China. It was believed to hold powerful properties, particularly in Taoist and early alchemical thought. It was used in medicines, elixirs, and imperial rituals. It was fluid, reflective, otherworldly. It looked like magic, which, to a man like Qin Shi Huang, would have been enough. This was, after all, a ruler who commissioned expeditions to find the islands of immortals, who consulted magicians and swallowed strange potions, and who died at age 49, possibly from mercury poisoning caused by the very elixirs meant to make him immortal. So when Sima Qian tells us that the first emperor wanted an underground empire with silver rivers and mechanical stars, we don't roll our eyes, we lean in. Because he wasn't just a megalomaniac. He was a visionary, terrifying, often cruel, but possessed by a singular idea that death was not the end, not for him. Not if he could trap the world in his tomb, preserve it in stone and metal, and design it to run forever. And here's where it gets strange. Unlike many other ancient tombs, Qin Shi Huang's burial chamber has never been opened. The Chinese government has declared it off-limits for now. The official reason? Preservation. The concern is that modern excavation tools could damage the site, destroy art, or trigger unintended chemical reactions. Unofficially, no one wants to open a door that might contain a toxic river. It's an eerie standstill. Scientists test the area using remote sensing technology. Geophysicists map anomalies beneath the mound. But the central chamber remains sealed, undisturbed, waiting. And so the story lives on. Not in the artifacts we've seen, but in the ones we haven't. The real mystery of Qin Shi Huang's tomb isn't what we know, it's what we still don't dare to know. And that tension between certainty and speculation is what keeps the legend alive. It's why Britannica still mentions the mercury, why documentaries bring it up like a guilty secret, why people across the world, who couldn't name 5 Chinese emperors, still know about the man with the underground river. Because in the end, it's not just a historical detail, it's a psychological key. We want to believe that someone, once, built the perfect afterlife, that someone thought far enough ahead, planned thoroughly enough, cared deeply enough to make eternity architectural. We want to believe the tomb exists, not just as a burial site, but as a statement, that even death can be designed, engineered, controlled. Of course, it can't. But it doesn't stop us from trying. And maybe that's what makes Qin Shi Huang's legend so powerful. He took the ultimate fear impermanence and tried to crush it under stone and metal, tried to terraform the afterlife, tried to convince the universe that he could keep ruling, even from beneath the earth, that he could take it all with him, the empire, the soldiers, the rivers, the sky. And we keep telling the story. We keep repeating the mercury rumor, not because it's confirmed, but because it feels confirmed. It resonates. It fits him. The man who unified China also tried to unify life and death. And that brings us, ironically, full circle to the way monarchy bends under the weight of mortality. For the next ruler we meet, mortality didn't wait for the grave. It came for him on the throne, a man so physically broken, so trapped in his own failing body, that the entire Spanish court began to wonder if he had been cursed. He was known as the Bewitched. And his story is not legend. It's diagnosis, desperation, and the slow unraveling of an empire. Enter Charles II of Spain, 24. Charles VI of France, again royal mental illness, as a literal costume problem. Monarchy loves metaphors. The king is the head of the state. The realm is his body. Order flows downward. Stability radiates outward. It's elegant. It's symbolic. It works beautifully right up until the moment the king himself no longer knows what he's made of. For Charles VI of France, this wasn't philosophical. It was literal. By the late 14th and early 15th centuries, Charles VI's mental illness had become so severe, so visible, and so disruptive that the entire machinery of French governance had to reorganize itself around one unstable human body, not metaphorically, practically, physically. Like stagehands maneuvering scenery around a lead actor who might forget the script, forget his name, or forget that he was king at all. And in some episodes, Charles believed something even more troubling, that his body was not flesh, but glass. This wasn't a passing odd thought or poetic flourish. It was a conviction strong enough to dictate behavior, protocol, and court logistics. Charles feared that a single wrong movement, an embrace, a jolt, an accidental bump could shatter him, so he avoided contact. He stiffened his posture. He demanded space. Some accounts describe reinforced clothing or special precautions taken around him, not because they worked, but because belief itself had become policy. Imagine being a medieval monarch whose authority depends on ritual touch coronations, blessings, physical presence, while believing your own body is too fragile to survive being touched. This is where the metaphor of the body politic breaks down completely. The king is not just unwell. The king is untouchable, not by reverence, but by fear, and fear is contagious. Charles VI inherited the French throne in 1380 at just 11 years old. At first, his reign looked promising. He was called Charles the Beloved. The kingdom, battered by the 100 Years' War, hoped for renewal. But in 1392, everything changed. During a military expedition, Charles suddenly attacked his own companions, killing several before being restrained. This was the first major public episode of what would become a lifelong pattern of mental collapse. From that point on, his reign became episodic, defined not by consistent rule, but by unpredictable cycles of lucidity and breakdown. Sometimes he functioned normally, issuing edicts and presiding over court. Other times, he didn't recognize his wife, believed impostors had replaced his servants, or insisted he was made of glass. And here's the crucial part. He did all this while remaining king. France didn't depose him. There was no mechanism for that. Instead, the state adapted. Councils formed, regents emerged, power drifted. Rival factions, most notably the Burgundians and Armagnacs, used the king's condition as justification for political maneuvering. Everyone claimed to act in the king's name, even when the king himself was absent from reality. The result was governance by improvisation. Court etiquette became a minefield. How do you approach a king who might panic if you come too close? How do you deliver news to someone who might believe you're an illusion? How do you dress a monarch who thinks his skin is brittle? This is where the idea of a costume problem becomes more than metaphor. Charles's clothing, posture, and surroundings had to be carefully managed, not to project power, but to prevent collapse. His body was no longer a symbol of strength. It was a liability. And yet, he still had to appear kingly. So the court performed a delicate balancing act. They staged appearances during his lucid phases. They limited access during episodes. They adjusted ceremony. They whispered instructions. They created routines meant to soothe, distract, stabilize. Governance became less about ruling the realm and more about managing the king. It's tempting, from a modern perspective, to medicalize Charles VI completely to frame his story purely as psychiatric history. But that misses something essential. His illness didn't exist in a vacuum. It existed inside a political system that demanded certainty from a man who could not provide it. Every time Charles believed he was glass, it wasn't just a delusion. It was a crisis of legitimacy. If the king's body is symbolic, what happens when the symbol cracks? The answer, in France's case, was chaos. Civil war erupted between rival noble factions, each claiming to protect the crown while undermining it. The 100 Years' War worsened. Foreign powers exploited the instability. The infamous Treaty of Troyes in 1420, signed while Charles was still alive, disinherited his own son and effectively handed the French throne to England. All of this unfolded while Charles VI remained physically present, crowned, anointed, officially sovereign, but mentally unreachable for long stretches of time. There is something uniquely unsettling about that. A king who cannot abdicate, cannot be replaced, cannot be reliably consulted. A ruler whose authority persists even when his consciousness does not. The crown becomes a mask worn by circumstance. And then there is the glass. The glass delusion wasn't unique to Charles VI. It appeared in other European cases during the late medieval and early modern periods. But Charles is its most famous victim, because, unlike others, he was a reigning monarch. His belief that he could shatter wasn't just psychological. It shaped how people moved around him, spoke to him, touched him. In a world where kings were expected to be warriors, judges, and living embodiments of God's order, Charles was convinced he might break if someone hugged him too hard. There is a bleak irony here. Medieval monarchy rested on the idea that the king's body was sacred, protected, inviolable. Charles internalized that idea so completely that his body became untouchable even to himself. He outlived most of his contemporaries, dying in 1422 after more than 4 decades on the throne. By then, France was fractured, humiliated, and in desperate need of a miracle, one that would soon arrive in the form of Joan of Arc, whose story is itself inseparable from the vacuum Charles left behind. But Charles VI remains the more haunting figure, because his reign forces us to confront something monarchies never want to admit, that power can outlast competence, sanity, and even identity. That the crown does not fall just because the head beneath it falters. That sometimes the state keeps going not because the ruler is strong, but because no one knows how to stop pretending. Charles VI wasn't a tyrant. He wasn't cruel. He was ill. And the tragedy of his life is not that he suffered many rulers did, but that an entire political system depended on pretending he wasn't. So they dressed him. They guarded him. They worked around him. They staged reality like a fragile play, hoping the lead actor wouldn't shatter under the lights. And in doing so, they revealed the ultimate fragility of monarchy itself. Not glass, but belief. And if Charles VI shows us what happens when a king's mind fractures in public, the final story in this sequence returns us to Rome, where a story that may not be true at all still survives, because it perfectly captures a society's fear of humiliation by power. A horse, a senate, and a rumor that refuses to die. 25. Caligula, again, because the myth reveals the Roman fear of humiliation by power. It's one of those stories you hear before you even know who Caligula really was. A Roman emperor, deranged, despotic, and maybe drunk, appoints his horse to the Senate, maybe even made it consul. The implication: he had so little respect for Rome's political system that he replaced its most powerful men with livestock. Power, weaponized as insult. You probably laughed the first time you heard it. You probably also assumed it was true. It's not, at least not exactly. And yet, the story won't die. Not because of what it says about Caligula, but because of what it says about the world he ruled and the people he ruled over. It's not about equestrian politics. It's about fear. Specifically, the fear that power doesn't just corrupt and humiliates. Let's rewind. Caligula ruled from 37 to 41 CE, following the death of Tiberius. His real name was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, but he was nicknamed Caligula, or Little Boot, by soldiers during his childhood, thanks to the miniature military gear he wore while tagging along with his father's legions. He hated the name, but history kept it anyway, possibly the first of many indignities. At first, his reign looked promising. Rome welcomed him enthusiastically. He was young, charismatic, and crucially not Tiberius. But within months, something shifted. Ancient sources say Caligula fell seriously ill. After recovering, they claim, he changed. The man who emerged was erratic, theatrical, and increasingly disturbing. Now, historians are cautious. Much of what we know about Caligula comes from later writers Suetonius, Cassius Dio, Tacitus, who had political and moral axes to grind. They paint a portrait of madness. An emperor who declared himself a god, demanded worship, dressed as deities, indulged in cruel games, and delighted in mockery. And at the center of this moral panic is the story of Incitatus, Caligula's horse. According to Suetonius, Caligula gave the horse a marble stall, an ivory manger, a jeweled collar, and a house with slaves. He fed it oats mixed with gold flakes. He supposedly held dinner parties where Incitatus was the guest of honor. And, most famously, he allegedly planned to make the horse a consul, the highest elected office in Rome. Notice the phrasing, planned to, not did. Even Suetonius, who gleefully catalogued Caligula's excesses, stops short of saying it actually happened. And modern historians agree. There's no solid evidence that Incitatus was ever formally appointed to anything. But that's not the point. The story of the horse consul has stuck for 2,000 years not because it's verified, but because it's psychologically perfect. It encapsulates everything Romans feared most about autocracy, that a man with absolute power could render their centuries-old system of governance meaningless on a whim. The Senate was supposed to be Rome's sacred institution, the cradle of republican virtue even after the republic had long since collapsed into empire. Senators clung to ceremony, tradition, dignity. To appoint a horse to their ranks would be to turn that dignity into farce. And Caligula, whether he meant it seriously or not, understood that. Some scholars interpret the episode as satire, a calculated insult, not a genuine appointment. By threatening to install Incitatus, Caligula wasn't showing affection for his horse. He was showing contempt for the Senate. He was saying, "You are so useless that even this animal could do your job." It's not insanity, it's performance. A cruel, sardonic joke made at the expense of people who still thought they had power. Others go further and argue that the story wasn't Caligula's joke, it was Rome's, created after his death to retroactively explain and condemn his reign. After all, he was assassinated in 41 CE, stabbed to death by his own guards. The Senate briefly tried to restore the Republic, but failed. His successor, Claudius, quietly returned things to business as usual. But the myth of the mad emperor lived on. Because in that myth, Romans found something irresistible: moral clarity. Caligula wasn't just a bad ruler, he was chaos incarnate, a man who violated the natural order, who mocked piety, justice, and hierarchy, who ruled not like a statesman, but like an actor, staging an absurdist play. And in that absurdism, the horse story became iconic, because it posed a question that still unsettles us. What happens when power is no longer serious? When the rituals of governance are upheld by people who do not believe in them? When the robes, titles, speeches, and votes are reduced to theater? Caligula's reign was short, but the moral anxiety he triggered has lasted millennia. That's why the story matters even if it's false. Because it's not about the horse. It's about the humans watching, sitting in their togas, trying to act with dignity, as the emperor drops another gilded oat into a manger and smiles like he knows a secret no one else can say aloud. It's about humiliation. The kind that comes not from defeat, but from being mocked while powerless. Modern autocrats often perform similar pageantry, show trials, symbolic appointments, farcical ceremonies, not to advance an agenda, but to signal absolute control, to make everyone else play along, to remind the governed that truth is irrelevant and worse, that they'll still have to clap. In that sense, Caligula's horse is not a footnote, it's a warning. A reminder that the most devastating use of power isn't brute force, it's irony. It's making the system dance to nonsense and watching no one dare to say stop. Which brings us to the full circle of this list, not just of monarchs behaving bizarrely, but of how power itself begins to distort reality. When private delusion becomes public policy, when a personal obsession becomes a national crisis, when a king's dream turns into his country's nightmare. These 25 stories, ranging from glass-boned kings and tombs of Mercury to cross-dressing emperors and Gothic mourning rituals, aren't strange just because they're extreme. They're strange because they're true. True enough to be documented, true enough to leave traces. True enough that centuries later, we still feel the psychological chill of how thin the line is between rule and ruin. Because in the end, monarchy has always been a gamble. Put too much power in one pair of hands, and you may get a statesman, or a mystic, or a dreamer, or a child who never grew up, or a man who feeds oats to his horse while senators wait outside. The crown doesn't guarantee wisdom, only theater. And the more elaborate the play becomes, the harder it is to tell if you're still watching history or if you've wandered into a myth. The throne stays still, but everyone else keeps spinning.